Hear all these stories anywhere you listen to podcasts on the Let's Read podcast. My name's Sean, and I'm from Ireland. To cut a long story short, I used to take part in amateur boxing fights, hoping to break into the professional circuit. But to keep protein on my plate in between bouts, I used to work for a private security firm in my home city of Dublin. I thought it'd all be on the doors, like being a bouncer, but as it turned out, there was more to private security than throwing drunks out of bars. That was a lot of what the job consisted of, don't get me wrong. But every so often, we got a job that was a bit out of the ordinary. For example, I had to guard a place of worship at one point because some absolute tools were camped out trying to intimidate the people going in and out. We got hired to guard a nursery once too, if you can believe that, because some mental case had come around threatening the kids and the Gardaí couldn't get hold of them. But without a doubt, the most memorable and most unusual event I was ever asked to provide security for was a funeral. But not just any funeral. It was for the boss of one of Dublin's biggest crime families. I'm not joking. This was back in 1991, when I was just 23, and by that time, I'd gotten used to getting the occasional weird job. But when my boss told me that we were to guard a funeral one Friday morning in September, I couldn't help but ask him for more details. It wasn't just me either. Everyone had their questions about it. Then, when our boss filled us in, we could barely believe our eyes. I doubt anyone listening to this would recognize the name, but if you were alive in Dublin around then, and I said the Fitzies, then you're definitely going to know who I'm talking about. Anyway, Big Fitz had kicked the bucket, as you know, and he was going in the ground that Friday morning, and since the family was quite easily the wildest in all of Ireland, the big man's funeral needed many security guards. I believed it too. A family that mental and violent, with all that booze and grief in them, it'd probably look like a 5-card Vegas fight night by the time the buffet opened up. At least, that was the joke we were all sharing at the time. We just didn't know how right we were. We were told we wouldn't be needed at the church service, only at the Fitz family home, since that's where the alcohol would start flowing properly. Then on the morning of the funeral, we arrived at around 11 at this big mansion on the outskirts of the city. I'd never seen anything like it in the flesh, only on the television maybe, but not up close. It was like someone's dream home, all castle on the outside with modern living on the inside. They even had a maid that showed us around the place before the family got back from the church service, and we had to put on our professional hats to keep the place secure. The first black Range Rovers began turning up outside around 11:30, and out came a steady stream of weeping older women supported by their sons and nephews. It looked a lot like any other funeral, I suppose, only this one had outfits some people's whole salaries might not be able to cover. There was more Gucci and Prada than an Italian fashion show, and I couldn't tell which reflected the sun's glare brighter, the fancy leather on their shoes or the fancy watches on their wrists. Don't ever tell me crime doesn't pay. The mood was very tense at first, as you can imagine it would be among a family full of violent gangsters, possibly even murderers. But aside from that very large aspect of the job, it was much like any other funeral for the first couple of hours. In fact, one of the hardest jobs I had in those first few hours was refusing all the drinks the Fitz family was offering. They were a wild bunch, but they grieved like any other Irish family, which meant that after all the teary-eyed tributes and hugs among the bereaved, the party started. By about 2 p.m, spirits were high, music was thumping inside the house, and me and the lads were starting to wonder what we'd been worried about. We pictured some intra-family disagreements descending into mindless violence, but in reality, we were in more danger of getting hit on by drunk women in their 50s than being part of any sort of brawl. We had 4 more hours to keep guard, and these 4 hours seemed like they'd be some of the easiest we'd ever worked. But then, it happened. The home's back garden was massive, and I mean truly massive. There was a big lawn, a football pitch and tennis courts combo toward one side, then a big pond and a gazebo on the other. We had 4 fellas surrounding the house, myself included, then 2 inside, which we kept on cycling to give them a break from all the harassment at the hands of the menopausal cougars. I was round the front, talking to a fellow guard, when we both suddenly hear the lad round the back talking over his radio. Someone had started banging on the backyard fence, pretty hard too, and then the next thing, we hear him swear before all went quiet. We ran around back of the house to see what the issue was, and then arrived just in time to see a man wearing all black and a balaclava smash his way through the fence using a sledgehammer. He gave the fence one last bash to really open it up, and then in streamed about a dozen identically dressed fellas, all carrying the likes of baseball bats, hammers, and clubs. Aside from the odd kosh or pair of brass knuckles we were carrying on the sly, none of us were armed well enough to defend against an attack like that. So instead, we focused on getting everyone inside and securing the home's back doors behind us. But since one of those back doors was a big glass sliding one, you can imagine how well that went for us. The masked men simply smashed their way into the home as we were getting everyone either out the front or upstairs to safety. But that's where the second problem came in, because many of those inside didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. All they knew was that someone had turned up looking for a fight, so in their state of drunkenness, they were all well up for a scrap. They just didn't realize the attackers were armed until it was too late, but even then, that didn't deter many. And what followed was a bloodbath. The men of the Fritz family put up a brave and brief defense, but they were all blind drunk and had nothing but their fists. 1 or 2 of them managed to land a punch or 2, one of which knocked an attacker clean out. But anytime that happened, the gang of attackers would swarm, beat the defiant man till he was either screaming or silent, then they'd move on to the next. I suppose they did what they had to do in a way, making sure security had the space to evacuate all the women and kids to wait in cars or safe areas upstairs. But it was only a matter of minutes before the gang beat back any resistance and started making their way towards the stairs. At that point, it became a question of how to keep the gang of attackers from advancing up those steps. I was freaking out, thinking, there's no way we're going to be able to hold them off. But to my surprise, the Fitz family had already planned for such an event, in that they'd stocked their master bedroom with a couple of unconventional, but very effective defensive weapons. Big Fitz, before he died, had been quite the collector of martial antiquities, including a samurai sword, 2 Zulu short spears, and a broadsword said to have belonged to the King of Leinster. I didn't know this all at the time, obviously. The first I saw them was when one of the grannies upstairs started handing them out to us. One minute it was Lord of the Dance, the next it was Lord of the Rings. I'd never held a spear before, but there's a first time for everything in life, I guess. And the gang of attackers had absolutely rampaged through the home by the time we formed that final line of defense on the stairs. There were unconscious and severely injured people lying all over the kitchen, including one of our security team, but the gang wanted more. Yet when they got to the stairs and saw what they were up against, they very understandably hesitated. I remember gripping the short spear, called an Iqua, and telling some balaclava-wearing scumbag that if he tried coming up the stairs, I was going to skewer him like a feckin' kebab. He looked just as shocked as I was to see a bloody Zulu short spear being pointed in his face, but that shock and awe worked majorly to our advantage, and no one fancied a piece of it. There's this standoff on the stairs with everyone screaming at each other. Then the next thing I know, the women and kids upstairs with us started throwing things down from the floor above at the gang of masked attackers. I'm talking stiletto heels, little marble statuettes, big glass ashtrays, anything heavy or jagged enough to do some damage started raining down onto the attackers below. I remember seeing this one big ashtray land on this fella's head, and he actually collapsed to the ground, even started shaking and twitching. His pals started screeching, trying to wake him up, and then trying to drag him out towards the back garden, but those missiles kept coming. I suppose that's what saved us in the end. Having us forming that line of defensive was one thing, but we were still outnumbered and outgunned, so to speak. One swing of that sledgehammer would have smashed my spear. I know the gang could have taken us if they wanted to, not without a couple of serious injuries, but they'd have been able to do it if they really, really wanted to. But it was those screaming harpies above and beside us that won the day. By the time the gang retreated to the back garden again, the home's hallway was just a mess of blood, broken glass, marble dust, and broken shoes. The gang had also started to smash things on their way out, probably as a final FU to the Fitzes. But that was nothing compared to the damage they'd done to the men of the family. Like I said before, we might have done a job in protecting the more vulnerable members of the family, but those that had tried to fight back had been subjected to what I can only describe as a bloodbath. There were broken legs, broken arms, broken ribs, and fractured skulls. People's teeth were smashed, their fingers were literally hanging off in places, and one guy's eye had popped out of the socket following a really severe skull fracture. We had to keep all the kids upstairs while the EMTs carried everyone outside. We could hide their eyes from the injuries, but trying to ensure they didn't hear the screams was basically impossible. They only died down when the small army of paramedics started pumping painkillers into the victims, but even then, what were screams became these terrible groans and moans as the wounded were ferried to waiting ambulances. The Gardaí had been there for a while by the time the wounded were all taken to hospital, and I have expected everyone to give them the cold shoulder. But even though some of these people had been involved in criminality all their lives, and their whole motto was basically, "Don't talk to the Gardaí," they had zero problem telling them absolutely everything about the masked gangs attack. I suppose when it suits them, criminals use the Gardaí as a weapon like any other, not just to punish their enemies, but to identify them in cases where they've concealed their faces during an attack. But why attack a funeral like that, and who in their right mind would target a funeral of all things? Well, as far as I know, the answer's a pretty simple one. The attackers were a rival criminal family the Fitzes had rubbed the wrong way one too many times, and the why is even simpler. Because they could. Our colleague that was wounded during the melee ended up needing about 30 stitches to put his head and face back together, and he never returned to work after that. I also heard something about the guy who was knocked unconscious with that big glass ashtray. He didn't report to the hospital straight away. He couldn't, but that meant the brain injury he'd received got worse and worse until finally he showed up at A&E begging for help because he kept having seizures. Apparently the doctors asked him how he hurt his head, but then instead of just making something up, he goes to tell them exactly what had happened. He says he and his pals raided the Fitz's property where he'd gotten a bonk on the head and he didn't remember anything else. The doctors start doing brain scans, trying to work out the damage, then once they were done, the cops showed up and arrested him. His gang got him a lawyer who instructed him not to say another word regarding who was present at the raid. Then in the end, this poor guy was the only one to go down for what had happened, and all because that brain injury meant that he couldn't think properly anymore. His fellow gang members let it happen too, because he was no use to them out in the streets anymore, and he had two choices: keep his mouth shut and do his time, or they'd have him killed in prison to keep him quiet for good. That wasn't strictly the end of the whole affair either, and after about 6 months of calm, some of these rival gangsters started turning up dead all over Dublin. Not all of them, mind you, just the ones that the Fitzes were sure had raided their house on the day of that funeral, and not long after the bodies started turning up, I handed in my notice. I came in to realize that some security firms, at least in Ireland, were Siamese twins with some of the country's crime families. There was just no separating them without at least one half dying a death. I asked my boss if that was the end of us working with families like the Fitzes, and he gave me an honest answer when he told me no. We worked for whoever pays, and that was that. It's just that in our case, the people willing to pay the big bucks for security tended to need it for all the wrong reasons. I ended up signing on to a different firm later on, one that dealt almost exclusively in providing security guards to the likes of HMV and Tesco. The pay wasn't as good, obviously, but it was a much quieter life, and I got to focus on my boxing much more too, although my career never took off in the way that I'd hoped. That didn't bother me much though, because I got to settle down, live a quiet, peaceful life and start a family, all without having to worry about masked thugs attacking me and mine when we were at our weakest. I grew up in Modesto in the 1980s, and honestly, I fell in with a kind of bad crowd. I had a couple of friends end up in jail. I had a couple end up in the ground, too. But it was the ones that said enough is enough that I really admired. The ones that got out before the life we lived became an anchor around our necks. I decided to clean myself up, and since driving was kind of my thing, I figured that I'd get a job at a cab company so I could earn an honest living while still driving around the city that I knew and loved. By 1991, I was 24, and I'd been taking fares around Modesto for almost 2 years. It was a hell of a job, let me tell you, and every so often, I got a real character in the back of my cab. Like this one time, I had this raspy-voiced little guy flag me down, and when I asked him his story, it turned out he was Sonny Barger, a founding member of the Hells Angels. I asked why he wasn't on his bike, and he looks me dead in the eye through my rear view and says, "'Cause I've had 14 beers, 5 shots of tequila, and I'm too goddamn old to spend the night in jail." I laughed my ass off with the guy, and he was a great tipper too, so shout out to the Hells Angels, I guess. But not everyone was so cool or entertaining. In fact, I picked up 1 or 2 passengers in my time that got me in a hell of a lot of trouble, and this is one of them. So it was August 2nd of 1991, around 8:30 at night, because the sun had just gone down, and I was driving down the avenue about to take the 108 toward downtown. It was a Friday, so I knew I was in for a busy night, and I was just about to take my turn when I saw a girl standing at the side of the road sticking her thumb out to passing cars. My first thought was, it is not the time to be hitchhiking out here, because Fridays and Saturdays always got a little crazier when the sun went down. So I pulled over next to her, honked my horn, and then when she came up to my driver's side, I didn't even get to ask where she was headed before she said something like, "I don't got any money, sorry. I just really need a ride." And from the sound of her voice, how shaky it was, I could tell that she'd been crying. So rather than just drive off like some jerk, I told her to hop in and that I'd give her a free ride. She responds with, "Oh my God, really? Oh, thank you so much." Very grateful, and that it sounds like she's going to start crying again. So she hops in the back of my cab and she tells me that she wants to go to the airport. I tell her my name, then ask her what hers is, and then as we're driving, I start asking if she's okay, and that I know you're not, but asking what's wrong is too forward kind of way. She tells me she's just ended things with her boyfriend of 3 years, and that she's headed to the airport to catch a plane to Florida, which was where her grandparents lived. I told her how sorry I was, but that she'd be surprised to know just how many young women like her I gave rides to on a weekly or sometimes even daily basis. It's a sad fact of life that relationships sometimes fall apart, and when they do, someone usually pulls the old Hail Mary full of grace, "Get me out of this goddamn place." And that's where yours truly comes in. She didn't laugh, but I didn't expect her to either. So after my dumb attempt at humor, I started saying how happy I was to lend an ear if she wanted someone to talk to. She had to get herself together a little before she started talking, and she was a slow starter too, just didn't know where to begin, I guess. But once she got going, she got going. So I shut up, let her talk, and listened to her story. She moved to California from the East Coast for college, met her boyfriend during her junior year, then moved in with him after she graduated and needed a place to stay. She said when they met, he'd been the perfect gentleman. He'd supported her emotionally through those final 2 years of college, then financially for a while too after she graduated and was looking for a job. He'd always been kind and patient with her, but then over time, while she was still trying to find work, he started to change. He got less and less patient and more mean. They never used to fight at all, and then over time it got to the point they were fighting 2 or 3 times a week. She said the field she wanted to work in was very competitive, and that while she was working her butt off sending out resumes and making calls, she wasn't having any luck. But then the longer that went on, the more impatient her boyfriend was getting, and over time it became this huge source of tension that she wasn't contributing at all. She said she was looking for waitress jobs and stuff right at the time they had their huge breakup fight. By then, her boyfriend wasn't interested. He told her to pack her bags, started throwing some of her stuff around, then things started to escalate, and the fight ended violently before she ran out of the house with her suitcase all packed. My dad used to get violent with my mom before he walked out on her, so as soon as she said that last thing, I was ready to drive back to where she'd come from and give her ex an ass kicking before driving her back to the airport. I told her I was sorry things ended that way, then asked if she was all right, if she needed me to take her to the hospital first thing or anything like that. She said no, that he hadn't really hurt her, but then I asked if she wanted me to stop so she could call the cops. And for the first time, she gave me this immediate, desperate reply of no. And that was the first warning sign right there, the thing that made me think that I might have seriously misjudged the situation in front of me. I told her that if he'd hit her or broke any of her stuff, then it was important to report that sort of stuff to the cops so that they at least had it on record. But she insisted I just drive her to the airport so she could leave to go with her grandparents. At the time, I understood the impulse, or at least I thought I did. The poor girl just went through something traumatic. She didn't want to hang around going over a play-by-play with a bunch of bozos. She just wanted to get away from it. But like I said, there was something about that no that sounded a little too desperate. I asked if she did anything like hit him back, and that's why she wasn't so focused on talking to the law. But I was also quick to reassure her that the cops would consider anything she did in self-defense to be just that, self-defense. She started saying how they wouldn't see it that way, but when I asked why not, she straight up snapped at me. She says, "Because they won't, all right? Now can you just take me to the airport? I'm begging you." She started off all cold and angry, but by the time she got to the "I'm begging you" part, she was back to sounding like a scared little girl again. I guess that tugged at my heartstrings enough for me to back down a little, just not quite enough for me to drop it altogether. I kept quiet for a moment or two, gave her some time to breathe, and suggested if her ex had done something like hit her, then the best revenge would be having him spend a night in the cell. And then she muttered, "That's not going to happen." I didn't see it for what it was, so I followed up with something like, "Are you really going to let this piece of trash do you like this?" That's when she said, with this heavy tone of voice that set the hairs on the back of my neck on end, "He's not going to do anything to anyone anymore." Bingo. Their fight had ended in violence, all right, but not with this girl's ex smacking her around. It ended with her doing something to him. And the way she said that last thing about him not doing anything anymore, it made me think she'd done more than just slap him or whatever. I started saying something like, "Miss, if you did something bad, I gotta let you out of the cab, otherwise you're making me an accessory to whatever's going on." I didn't know if that was 100% true at the time, but I'd heard it was, and that was enough for me, so that's what I said. I also added that if all she did was toss a lamp at him or something like that to keep him away from her, then whatever, I'd take her to the airport. But if she did something else, if she left him bleeding somehow and in need of a hospital, then that was another story. As I waited for her answer, I heard her rustling around in the back. My eyes darted up to the rear view and I saw her reaching into her jacket seconds before I heard the distinct click of a handgun being armed. I'd been robbed 3 times in 2 years by that point, so I knew that sound well enough to know that the girl I first thought was the innocent victim of domestic abuse had just pulled a gun on me in the back seat. I remember how the words, "Well there, miss, there's no need to do anything rash," came out of my mouth without me even trying to speak. Then that same shaky, teary-eyed sound returned to her voice as she said, "Just take me to the airport. I don't want to do anything to you, so please don't make me. I just want to get out of here." I didn't ask her anything else. I wanted to. Good Lord, I wanted to. But I valued my life far more than I valued getting any more answers. I figured there might be a chance there was a dude out there someplace, lying on his kitchen floor, bleeding to death with a bullet in his gut. Maybe a scumbag who hit his girl did deserve to suffer a little. But I don't believe in the death penalty. I wanted to know more than anything if some poor son of a bitch was crawling around in a pile of his own blood and poop. Because God knows I'd want someone to call me an ambulance if I'd heard about it. I did end up calling someone, but that came later, and I guess I should just get on with the story, so I just drove, not saying a goddamned word because I was terrified and I'm not afraid to say it. This girl had all but admitted to shooting a man, and I had this creeping feeling she might do it again if it meant not being able to get to her grandparents. That's even if there were any grandparents, because if that were me, I'd be thinking more about some place in South America than heading to Florida. I drove her all the way to the airport, not saying a word. Then when we got close to the little drop-off point, the girl told me to stop the car and that she'd walk the rest of the way. I did as she asked, stopped the car in the darkness away from the crowd of people getting in and out of cars, and then she asked me to turn off the engine and hand over my keys. I figured she wasn't about to shoot me, not close enough to all those people for them to hear the gunshots, so at first I said, "I can't do that, miss. I gotta make a living." But then, in a way that made my blood run cold as ice in my veins, I think she showed me the real her for a second. I'd kinda half turned my head as I told her I didn't want to give her my keys, and I was about to tell her how I wouldn't say a word to anybody when she stuck the barrel of that gun right in my face. And when I say she stuck it in my face, I don't mean she just pointed it at me. I mean she shoved the muzzle into the skin of my temple so hard it hurt, and then told me, "Give me your keys." I had one last bit of resistance in me, one last appeal to her good nature, and I tried to tell her, "You can't just take away a man's means of making money. How am I supposed to feed my kids if I can't drive my cab?" I didn't have any kids at the time, but I've said just about anything to keep a hold of my keys because I wasn't kidding when I said I needed them to make a living. But she didn't even let me get past "you can't" before she exploded about how I wasn't allowed to tell her anything, how all men were the same, thinking they could control every woman, and how this one wasn't going to let that happen. She then repeated that I was to give her my keys, or I wouldn't be going home to see my non-existent kids that night, or any night for that matter. I'm not stupid. I knew the best thing to do from there on out was to shut the F up and do as she told me. So I handed over my keys, watched her climb out of my cab before she dragged her suitcase out behind her, and then as she walked off towards the terminal with that same poor me attitude she'd had when I first saw her. I waited till she was out of sight, then rushed towards the terminal to where the payphones were, and then called 911 looking over my shoulder the whole time. I knew there might be airport security inside the terminal, but I also knew the girl would not be too happy to see me there, and I didn't want to risk getting shot when I could just call the cops from outside the building. I wasn't going anywhere. That girl had my keys, so I had to just sit outside the terminal and wait for the cops to show up. But by the time they did, the girl had put herself on the first flight to the Bahamas or wherever she went, having obviously gotten rid of that gun somehow, but not my car keys. I had to get some help jump-starting my cab just to get home. And then my cab was basically out of action until the company could get a new key shipped to them. But I had my life, and man did that feel like something special after having that crazy bitch in my back seat. Back in 1999, I was a scrappy 18-year-old kid from rural Ontario, and since I didn't like the idea of working at a mill or driving a plow, I decided to join the army. Enlisting wasn't too complicated back then, but it wasn't a cakewalk either. I walked into the recruitment center in Kingston, and then a couple of corporals asked about my fitness, my grades, and why I wanted to join. I gave them some stock answer about wanting to serve my country, but really, I just wanted to get the hell away from Hanover. 2 years later, I was a private with Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, stationed in Edmonton. It was early autumn, and I was in the mess hall scarfing down a late breakfast after our run when someone yelled out to crank up the volume on the TV. The screen showed the Twin Towers in New York. Smoke was pouring out of a hole in one of them, then a few minutes later, the second plane hit. The room went dead quiet. Dudes forgot that they were even eating. Then we watched, totally stunned as the towers collapsed and ash-covered people ran through ash-covered streets. Over the next few hours, the news kept replaying the planes, the fire, and the chaos. and the mess hall filled up with guys just glued to the TV. We all knew it, even before the CO started briefing us. War was coming, and it was going to be bad. The world we'd trained for, all the peacekeeping missions and Cold War cleanup, was gone. We were headed to Afghanistan, and it wasn't going to be some UN mission handing out blankets either. It was going to be ugly, and we'd be in the thick of it. I feel this mix of dread and excitement, like history was about to drop the puck for us. But in 2002, the itch to do more than patrol and train got me thinking about JTF-2, Canadian Special Operations Forces, the real deal. If I wanted to guarantee a spot in frontline operations in Afghanistan, that was the ticket. Getting into JTF-2 was the toughest thing I've ever done. I was in decent shape, but decent just didn't cut it with how brutal that selection process was. They dragged us out to the backwoods of Ontario for a month of hell. We got barely any sleep and were subjected to a constant mix of ruck marches or navigation drills in the dark. But the worst were the psych tests designed to mess with your head. The directing staff would scream at you, starve you, anything to push you towards quitting. I saw good soldiers, tough as nails, break down and walk away. I didn't crack, but I came close. After that came specialized training, close quarters combat, advanced weapons, parachuting, the works. It took a further year before I was badged in as a JTF-2 operator, but when I was, it was the proudest moment of my entire life. By the time I deployed to Afghanistan in 2003, I felt ready for anything. We piled into a Hercules out of Trenton, with a cargo hold stuffed with gear and guys from JTF-2. Then we all tried to catch a few hours of sleep to make the long-haul flight go faster. The plane droned on for what felt like forever, and we stopped to refuel somewhere in Europe before landing at Kabul International. When we stepped off the ramp, we saw mountains standing tall against the horizon and the city sprawled out in front of us in a cloud of dust. And then, and only then, did it actually feel real. Me and my unit ended up being based at Camp Julian near Kabul, a dusty compound ringed with HESCO barriers and razor wire. Inside, it was all tents, connexes, and the constant hum of generators. We needed those jennies too because the heat was brutal. It had to be like 40 degrees Celsius in the shade sometimes, and the dust got into everything. Your rifle, your nostrils, and other less mentionable places too. Afghanistan itself seemed like a kind of paradox to me. You had those beautiful mountains and green valleys and all that rich history, but they had nothing to show for it. Just blown out villages and kids begging for pens. The people were tough. I mean, they had to be to survive decades of war, but many were kind and welcoming and would offer us chai or flatbread with glimmers of hope in their eyes, thinking that maybe this time things were going to be different. But as you might know, they weren't. As JTF-2 operations were high tempo and high stakes, we weren't doing foot patrols or handing out aid. We were hunting bad guys, mainly Al-Qaeda, but sometimes Taliban too. Direct action missions were the core. We'd roll out in GMVs or on foot with NVGs moving silently through villages where barking dogs could blow your cover. Then we'd perform night raids on Al-Qaeda safe houses, kicking in doors, clearing rooms, and grabbing high-value targets like bomb makers or commanders. Other times we'd do recon, lying up in the hills for days watching insurgents through optics, then calling in airstrikes when the time was right. We'd also sometimes work with our counterparts in the SEALs and Delta, sharing intel or hitting compounds together. And every op was a gamble. We were up against IEDs, ambushes, or sometimes just bad intel that could turn a clean snatch into a fatal firefight. The adrenaline was addictive, but the weight of what we were doing wore us down and sometimes seemed like the more you tried to change Afghanistan, the more it only changed you instead. A few months after the coalition went into Iraq, so late 2003, my guys and I were hauled up at a compound on the outskirts of Kabul when we got news of a job. Our CO said that we'd be linking up with a CIA outfit called Task Force Sabre 7 for a joint operation that involved hitting the suspected hideout of an Al-Qaeda bomb maker. We'd done these kinds of ops before, snatched the target, grabbed the intel, in and out, and JTF-2 doesn't mess around, so I figured these CIA boys would be pros, just like the SEALs or Delta we'd run in with before. The name Task Force Sabre 7 sounded legit, like something straight out of the Tom Clancy novel. so we geared up, checked our C8s, and then rolled out expecting a tight operation. We met Sabre 7 at a rendezvous point just outside the village in the early morning hours, but right away, something felt off. The task force wasn't what any of us had expected. Instead of a slick crew of American spooks, it was 3 Americans and a mob of 15 Afghans, all kitted out in mismatched gear like they'd raided one of Kabul's many weapons markets. The guy in charge, a loudmouth calling himself Jack, strutted around in sunglasses and a U.S. Army uniform and talked like he was auditioning for a Hollywood war movie. He threw around terms like HVT and Intel Stream with this kind of forced bravado, but we could see it for the performance it was, and the Afghans under him looked more like hired muscle than a disciplined unit. They were twitchy, gripping their AKs like they were just itching to use them, so I had a bad feeling about them from the get-go. Some of us figured that they might prove us wrong, work their magic, and bag their guy, but the op was a crap show from the start. We were supposed to sweep the village methodically, house by house, looking for bomb-making materials, things like wires, chemicals, the usual signatures. But Jack and his boys treated it like a free-for-all. He barked orders at his Afghans in a kind of pidgin Persian, and then they stormed into mud-walled homes, kicking over furniture while screaming at families. We'd been trained to keep civilians calm, to de-escalate high-tension situations, but Jack's unit was doing the opposite. I saw one of his guys smash an old man's face with a rifle butt for no reason other than he was slow to do as commanded. And stuff like that is considered a serious infraction. But Jack didn't blink. He just kept yelling about bombs, the Taliban, and bin Laden. It was chaos, and it was clear he didn't know how to run a proper search. There was no grid pattern, no coordination. He'd point at random houses, claiming SIGINT had marked them as hot. But when we checked, all we'd find were blankets and cooking pots. It honestly seemed like things couldn't get any worse, but then somehow they did. Jack's Afghans started dragging people out of their homes and then lining them up in the dirt. I heard screams from a house down the street, and when I got there, Edima's 2 American guys were beating a shopkeeper, demanding he confess to being Al-Qaeda. The guy didn't even speak English, but Jack was right there minutes later, egging them on, saying stuff like, "Break him. He knows where the bombs are." But there was no evidence, no bomb-making equipment, just a terrified old man begging and pleading in the dirt. I pulled my sergeant aside and said something about how the task force didn't seem like they knew what they were doing. He nodded, tight-lipped, but we had our orders. We kept moving, but I felt sick, like we were complicit just by being there. The raid eventually wrapped up, but we found nothing. No bomb maker, no explosives. All we'd done was tear that village apart. Then, as we were prepping to exfil, a couple of Edima's Afghans came over, grinning like they'd won a prize. One of them pulled out a cloth bundle and unwrapped it. Inside were dried, shriveled pieces of human flesh, fingers, ears, and other parts I couldn't identify. They said it was from a woman they'd caught, claiming she was Al-Qaeda or Taliban. And I wanted to puke. These weren't soldiers. These were murderers and butchers. My team stood there, stunned into silence, as the Afghans laughed and passed the bundle around like some trophy. I looked at Jack, half expecting him to shut it down, but he just smirked and said something about how that was part of their war, not ours. Back at base, my sergeant lost it. He got in Jack's face, calling him out for letting his men run wild and for letting them take body parts as trophies. But Jack just shrugged, cold as ice, and said something about how he was just helping them clean house. I've seen some cold mother effers in my time, but the way that Jack guy acted was next level. My sergeant stormed off, radioed our CO, and told him we were done with those Sabre 7 clowns. We figured the CO would come down on us heavily since they were CIA, but he came back saying that he couldn't get a straight answer on who they were. He called an American officer in Kabul who swore the CIA had no record of any Task Force Sabre 7, and the Pentagon didn't know either. It was like Edima and his crew had materialized out of thin air. And we started quietly asking around trying to find out who the hell Jack really was, but nobody had any answers. Some of the American guys we worked with said that he'd been floating around Kabul since 2001, peddling fake Al-Qaeda videos and claiming he was hunting bin Laden. But it wasn't until mid-2004 that we started hearing whispers about what Jack was really up to. After that FUBAR raid with the so-called task force, we kept our distance from them. But then one day, the rumors started swirling. Jack wasn't some wannabe operator. He was running a private torture prison. The Afghan police raided his compound in July, and when the truth came out, it was worse than we could have ever imagined. He'd set up shop in a 2-story house in Kabul, a nondescript place you'd walk past without a second glance. But inside, it was a living nightmare. They'd turn it into their own private black site, with zero oversight and no rules. They called it a mission to hunt Al-Qaeda, but in reality, it was more like something out of a cheap splatter movie. Jack Adema was arrested, and so were his 2 sidekicks. One guy, Brent Bennett, was a former paratrooper, but the other guy, Ed Carballo, was literally just a journalist, former CNN and National Geographic too, who'd attached himself to Adema's fake unit so he could see some action. And their scam was terrifying and simple. They'd grab Afghans off the street, just regular folks like shopkeepers, farmers, anyone they decided was a quote-unquote terrorist. Then they'd drag them back to their makeshift torture prison before interrogating them. Those that gave false confessions were then handed over to the Americans, most likely in exchange for some kind of bounty and continued military assistance. 8 guys were found when the cops busted in, some hanging from their feet, others bound and hooded, all of them beaten to hell. The place had makeshift cells, chains on the walls, with all the blood and feces everywhere, and I heard that it stunk to high hell. Adema claimed he was interrogating high-value targets for intel on bin Laden, but it was all bullcrap. Most of those poor guys were just locals caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Afghan government said it was a straight-up war crime, and they were right too. Adema's crew used methods that were medieval, like hanging guys upside down for hours, sometimes days, until their bodies just sort of gave out. Other prisoners said their heads were held underwater while Adema and his Afghans screamed questions they couldn't answer. Sleep deprivation was another favorite of theirs. They'd keep the lights on, blast music, and shake their prisoners awake every time they passed out. There were reports of starvation too, guys left without food or water for days in order to break their will. Jack, whose real name was Jonathan, denied everything in court, claiming he never burned anyone with cigarettes, poured boiling water on them, or pulled out their toenails to extract confessions. But the survivors told a different story. They talked about being shackled in stress positions and the constant threat of beatings, or worse, if they didn't confess. Jack and his boys weren't interrogating anyone. They were torturing people for fun. I remember hearing about the raid on his place from one of our intel guys. Afghan police found bloodstains, ropes, and hoods, stuff like that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. The prisoners, some of whom were barely alive when they were found, told the court that Adema's crew treated them like animals, how they even taunted and laughed at them as they begged and screamed for mercy. Adema had the nerve to say that he was working for the Pentagon, but it was all lies. The US military had taken just one single solitary detainee from him back in 2002 or 2003, and had held the guy for a month before realizing he was a nobody. And after that, they cut him off. He'd conned everyone, from Northern Alliance warlords to journalists, into thinking he was legit, and everyone had fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker. Sometimes I think back to that raid that he tricked us into joining them on, and the dried body parts his Afghans showed us. I'm pretty sure that wasn't a one-off and Jack Adema had encouraged it, and then I wondered how much more suffering he inflicted before he was caught. He was sentenced to 10 years in September of 2004, and I get a real sense of satisfaction when I hear that news. But it didn't erase the guilt of having worked with him, even if it was for just a couple of hours. He ran that house of horrors for literally years, ruined some people's lives, and then walked away with a pardon from President Karzai in 2007. I know he ended up dying of AIDS in Mexico in 2012, and while the circumstances surrounding his death are really shady, I know for certain he never fully paid for what he did. And it's things like that which make me wish I was a religious man. But if by some slim miracle there really is a place people like that are punished when they die, then I know he's going to get far worse down there than he ever dished out up here. I used to be the area manager for a small chain of late-night diners here in Minnesota, and of all the strange incidents in my career, this was the most frightening. I wasn't at the diner the night it happened, but 2 of my employees were. It was a small spot just off the highway, open 24 hours, and surrounded by a field, some woods, and a very lonely stretch of road. Jenny and Mike had both been there for years when it happened, but after that night they both quit and didn't tell anyone but the cops what had happened. All I had to piece together was the security footage and a few vague hints from the police, and years later, I still think about what I saw and what I'll never figure out. I remember it being one of those brutal winter nights, the kind where the wind must have been rattling the diner like it was trying to get inside for a bowl of hot dish. Mike was our cook, a solid worker in his 40s with a wife and 2 kids who worked the night shift for the extra cash. Jenny was the waitress, a single mom in her 20s who was sharp as a knife and great with crowd control on her busier nights. They were reliable, the kind of employees you could trust, but who could handle themselves too. But that night, something walked into the diner that nothing could have prepared them for. I was at home sleeping when a phone call woke me up. The moment they said it was the police, it was like half a dozen espressos hit me all at once, and I listened as they said there had been an incident at the diner and how they needed access to the office so they could review the security tape. They didn't elaborate. They just said that it was bad and that Mike and Jenny were involved. I dragged myself out of bed and my stomach was all knotted up with worry, and then I drove through the snow with my head spinning with questions. Was it a robbery? 2 groups of drunk customers who had started a brawl? Or was it something more serious? By the time I got there, I had a whole bunch of different theories already laid out, but what I saw on that tape was something a whole lot worse than anything I'd expected. When I arrived at the diner, an officer in uniform was waiting for me, and then I led him to a cramped back office with an old beat-up TV and a dusty VHS player. He said he'd needed to take the tape with him as evidence, but he also asked if we could watch it first, just so he had a better idea of what had taken place. I said sure, rewound the tape to the time he requested, 2:30 a.m., and then after I pressed play, it came alive on the screen. It was quiet out front, with Mike in the kitchen scrubbing down the counters and Jenny out front wiping down tables in the dim light. Then the door swung open, and 2 men walked in. They were maybe late 20s or early 30s, dressed in faded jeans and thick jackets, but it wasn't their coats that set my nerves on edge. It was their faces. One had a tattoo on his neck that ran up onto his face, and the other had these cold, very hollow eyes that didn't seem to blink. They acted calm at first, like they were just a couple of drifters who wanted a burger. They slid onto stools at the counter and Jenny took their order. Mike cooked with his back to them, then Jenny brought the plates out. They kept to themselves while they ate, heads down and not doing much talking. I kept hoping that they'd finish and leave, only, obviously, they didn't. Out of nowhere, the one with the face tattoo reached into his hoodie and pulls out a handgun. The other followed, drawing his own before they each aimed at Mike and Jenny, who froze mid-motion like deer caught in headlights. Jenny's eyes went wide and her face went slack. Her mouth was wide open like a scream was just stuck in her throat. Mike's hands jerked up, trembling so bad that I could even see it in that terrible footage. And the 2 men didn't rush. With their guns, they motioned for Mike and Jenny to come out from behind the counter. They stumbled forward on shaky legs, with Jenny clutching the edge of the counter for a second before letting go. The 2 men then herded them to the back toward the walk-in fridge, and I figured they'd lock them inside before raiding the register and the safe. But instead, after shoving Mike and Jenny inside, they stepped in after them and pulled the heavy door shut behind them. The camera stayed on that closed door, and it stayed closed for 5, then 10, then 20 solid minutes. And I had to fast forward the tape a bunch of times, starting and stopping, but still the door stayed closed as my mind started to tick over, asking questions like, why go inside with them? And what the hell are they doing in there? I pictured Mike and Jenny in that freezing cold walk-in. 37 minutes is a long time to be trapped with 2 armed strangers in a box you can't escape, and the longer I watched, the worse that feeling of dread got in me. My mind started trying to fill in the blanks. Maybe they were threatening them while holding the guns to their heads, making them do things so unthinkable I can't even name them. The walk-in was big, but only by fridge standards. There was barely room for 4 people standing up. Were they standing there, shivering, too scared to do anything but what they were being told? But the tape gives me no clues. Finally, exactly 37 minutes after the door to the walk-in closed behind them, it opened up again. The 2 men stepped out, completely relaxed, like they just finished a bathroom break. The one with a face tattoo tugged his hoodie straight while the other scanned the room with those 2 empty eyes of his. And then they strolled back through the diner, not even glancing at the safe back in the office or cash register stuffed with bills. They didn't take a damn thing. Not a dime, not a burger, nothing. They headed for the door, moving casually, like they'd done what was the most normal thing in the world. Then they slipped out, climbed into a dark car parked just out of frame, and vanished into the snowy night. I sat there with a police officer standing next to me, and I remember my hands being clammy and how my heart thudded hard and fast in my chest. They didn't steal anything. They held 2 people at gunpoint for over half an hour in a freezing walk-in and walked away empty-handed. Or at least, that was what it looked like on the surface. But why? What did they do to Mike and Jenny in there? And the tape rolled on. About 15 minutes later, one of our regulars shuffled in, a trucker who always came in for coffee at odd hours. He looked around at the empty diner with his coat all dusted with snow, and then, after a few minutes of waiting around, he wandered behind the counter, probably wondering where the hell everyone was. He did the same thing in the back, just sort of wandered around shyly for a few minutes, and then after maybe 10 to 15 minutes of checking absolutely everywhere but the walk-in, he cracked it open and looked inside. You could see the exact moment that he saw something inside the walk-in because he pulls backwards. You couldn't see his face on the camera really at first, but as he walked away, another camera caught his expression, and he obviously looked like he'd seen a ghost. Back in the dining area, he fumbled for his phone and started calling someone, 911, but right after, he darted to the grills and shut them off so the place wouldn't burn down, bless his heart. And after that, he kept pacing as he talked on his phone, throwing these nervous glances at the fridge with his shoulders hunched like he expected something to, burst out of it. And 2 cops showed up minutes later. They talked to the regular, then after approaching the fridge, one of the officers nudged the door open with his boot. It looked like he'd yelled something with a gesture, like a sort of come-out motion, and then Jenny staggered out. Her hands were plastered over her eyes, and she was shaking so hard that one of the officers had to support her as she came out. Mike followed soon after, his own hands pressed tight against his face, but he moved differently, slower, like he wasn't so sure about leaving the walk-in. Suddenly, as the cops were guiding him away, Mike kind of twisted back away from them. Then, with his face covered with one hand, he reached for the door and tried to walk back inside. The cops yanked him backwards away from it, but Mike was trying to get back in the walk-in like his life depended on it. As the cops dealt with Mike's weird outburst, Jenny collapsed into a booth and curled up into a ball with her hands still shielding her face. A few minutes later, the cops seemed to talk Mike down, and they were able to walk him to a booth and sit him down. The cops then tried talking to them, kneeling and gesturing as they did, but it didn't look like they got anything. Mike and Jenny just stayed all catatonic with their hands over their eyes, like they'd seen something so awful they couldn't bear to look at anything else. It was chilling, watching them break apart without a word, and it was almost like whatever happened in that fridge had terrified them beyond belief. A little while later, a couple of EMTs rushed in. They talked to Mike and Jenny for a while, then walked them both to an ambulance. But even when they were outside, Jenny and Mike kept their hands clamped over their faces. One cop stayed behind, scribbling down notes, and then I saw myself on the tape bursting in, coat half buttoned with my face very tense and worried. And when the tape cut off, I felt sick. I remember turning to the detective and demanding to know what had happened in that walk-in, but he just shrugged. Mike and Jenny were in shock, and they weren't talking yet. There were no obvious injuries either, so apparently my guess was as good as his. The men hadn't beaten them or cut them, but whatever they did do, it had shattered them psychologically. The officer told me that they were digging for answers, but that was all they knew so far. After locking up behind me, I left the diner in a kind of horrified daze. Mike and Jenny were my people. I cared about them, and hearing they'd gone through something so terrible had my heart breaking in my chest. I tried seeing them at the hospital the next morning, but the staff turned me away. Then I tried calling their homes in the days afterwards, but neither wanted to talk to me. Then one at a time, over the weeks that followed, they each quit the diner. I heard Mike later moved to California, abandoning his wife and kids. She told me he was a wreck in the days before he left, not talking at all, barely sleeping or eating, and then one day, poof, he was gone. Jenny fled to a farm in Iowa with family and tried to piece herself together. Her mom later told me she was doing much better, but she'd still only talk in short, clipped sentences. The police report was a dead end too, and only referred to what had happened as an incident, with no specifics to speak of. And the diner changed after that. The staff at the other branches started gossiping about it being some kind of gang thing. Others swore it was some kind of twisted game, like they'd hurt him for fun. One cook even muttered about some kind of government conspiracy, but obviously I brushed that off. No one knew what was happening to Jenny and Mike except Jenny and Mike. But the not knowing just made it worse. Customers stopped coming at night, scared off by the rumors, and I couldn't blame them. I hated being there too, standing in a place where something so terrible had obviously happened. I added a night guard, triple-checked the cameras, and had panic buttons installed, but it felt like an empty gesture. The damage had already been done. And time dragged on, we hired new staff, and the night custom slowly trickled back, but I never forgot what happened there. I'd drive by at night, see the neon sign flickering away, and wondered who those men were. Sometimes I'd watch that tape back on my home computer and let those 37 minutes just roll by. And sometimes it went fast, and other times it felt like an eternity. Were they still out there, planning something else? And what was it they did in the first place that broke Mike and Jenny so badly? Eventually, I stopped watching the tape and taught myself to stop asking questions too, because these days, I feel like I'm better off not knowing. I was in the parachute regiment for just shy of 10 years before I was discharged on medical grounds. I was gutted at the time, but then once it sank in, I was pleasantly surprised by how many options I had available to me. I remember many years before, a friend's dad told me, "All you'll be able to do when you leave the army is drive lorries and kill people." But he was wrong. I got offers from some big-name private military contractors almost straight away, who promised me good money once I'd passed their much less demanding medical exams. But I also got a few handy suggestions from some old paratrooper friends. One guy was over in the States consulting on TV shows, like teaching actors how to shoot and move like they'd been trained and all of that. And he said the hours were horrible, but the money was great, and I was seriously considering flying out to meet him. But then I spoke to another old friend of mine who had a very different but very interesting proposition. He was working in CPP, or Close Personal Protection, which is the fancy term for working as a bodyguard. He'd found a job with a high-profile London-based company who provided bodyguards to some of the world's biggest stars during domestic and sometimes overseas visits. In so many words, he got to travel around the globe with some of the world's biggest celebrities, living a life of absolute luxury outside of his working hours. Not every job was like that, of course. Even after just 18 months, he'd already been to the Maldives, Singapore, and St. Lucia twice. They fast-tracked ex-military guys thanks to their discipline, training, and expertise, so I already had a foot in the door. Then a couple of months later, during my first assignment, I was like a duck to water. It wasn't as big of a buzz as being a paratrooper, but it scratched a lot of the same itches in terms of executing plans, staying switched on, and putting on a show of force. It felt natural, I was good at it, and I've been doing it ever since. But I won't lie, at first it seemed like proper basic work compared to soldiering. Teenage girls might make a lot of noise, and this might come as a bit of a shock to some of you, but they're simply not as dangerous as the Taliban. And while the mega fans can be slippery and quite disturbing with some of their delusions, they don't mean the subject of their obsession any harm. They're also terrified when they see a load of ex-army bodyguards marching towards them, demanding they step back or vacate the area. So for a long time, I didn't feel very threatened by anybody. But that changed with this one job I worked, when I got a nasty lesson in the kinds of people I should be prepared to deal with. So for every high-profile job we did, there'd be an extensive risk mitigation meeting, and if we were providing services for a touring musical artist, we had to have those meetings on each individual stop of the tour. Each city brought a different landscape of risks, and while those risks took on many different forms, the most unpredictable, and therefore the most difficult to deal with, were the people. Like I said, the vast majority of fans who wanted to breach our security cordon were only hoping to meet their idols. And when we caught them, they'd inevitably just apologize and cooperate with us. One guy cried, thanked us for not beating him up, and then called his mom asking her to pick him up from the venue. But unfortunately for us, they weren't all like that. So during those risk mitigation meetings, our bosses would often put together profiles of certain persons of interest. These mostly included the type of person mentioned above who, while irritating and unpredictable, were ultimately harmless. Every so often, though, you got a different breed of superfan, the kind of person whose obsession was about as far from amusing or endearing as it was possible to get. It was fairly obvious the fellow that I'm about to tell you about was dealing with some severe mental illness, and maybe he's gotten help for it and turned his life around, and I truly hope he has. But we'll just call him Walker. Walker the Stalker. So we're at the meeting, and one of our bosses brings up Walker the Stalker's PowerPoint profile, which includes his name, his picture, his criminal history, and a few screenshots of his blogs and social media pages. He seemed quite the character, with his numerous facial piercings and his bush of rainbow-colored curly hair. Someone joked that he looked like a clown, but there wasn't much to laugh at outside of his appearance. Walker was well and truly obsessed with the client we were guarding, and not even the kind obsessed where it's all worship and adoration. He was a very negative kind of obsession, as he seemed fixated on doing our client harm. Walker the Stalker seemed to think that our client was his wife. He also believed that her relationship with another prominent artist amounted to cheating, and for that, she deserved punishment, to use his words, not mine. I won't repeat any of the graphic stuff he said. It was disgusting, truly stomach-churning, and it's been so long that I'd never been able to quote any of it correctly anyway. But just take it from me, I'd seen and heard a thing or two during my time in the Army, and the things this guy posted on his blog were truly some of the worst things I'd ever seen written. And that was before we got the credible threats he'd posted regarding our client's tour stopping in his home city. They were some of the most urgent threats to life I'd ever seen on the job, and I instantly understood why he was being considered our high priority. This guy had uploaded pictures of himself wearing what amounted to a ninja costume, along with the weapons he was planning on using to get to our client. He had pepper spray, a stun gun, a pair of gloves with steel knuckles, and about half a dozen knives of varying shapes and sizes. He also boasted about getting his hands on the building plans for the venue our client was performing at, which seriously threw a spanner in the works for us in terms of our security plans. If someone's going to hang around the stage entrance trying to get an autograph, that's one thing. But if some seriously determined individual is fixated on gaining access to a venue, it can be very difficult to stop them without the right amount of manpower. But in those kinds of cases, it doesn't hurt to call in the cavalry. I'm pretty certain this is the same in other countries too, but here in the UK, issuing credible threats of violence to a person is against the law. This meant we could contact the local police force, share our person of interest online threats with them, and more often than not, they'd nip any threat in the bud on our behalf. We couldn't do this on every occasion, not even when the threats were credible, but since we had our person of interest's name, address, and an idea of his criminal history, we were able to point the police right at him. And this meant that he was likely going to spend the night of our client's performance in a cell. They're not exactly the proudest moments of our career, just picking up the phone and calling the police instead of doing any work ourselves. But if it works, so that's what we did. More often than not, within a few hours of making our complaint, we get a call back from the police saying that the person has been dealt with. Most of the time, that meant having a quiet chat with them and warning them that they could be arrested for harassment. Other times, the threats were so graphic that they'd be taken into custody and charged with malicious communication. But in this case, when we got our call back regarding Walker the Stalker, we were told he'd flown his coop. Police gained access to his property that afternoon after he failed to answer the door. Walker wasn't there, and his neighbors said they'd seen him leaving that morning wearing his all-black clothing and carrying a large sports bag. If that was true, there was a good chance Walker the Stalker was already in the vicinity of the venue and was simply waiting for the right time to strike. Hearing this sent me and my team into overdrive for a couple of hours. We scoured the surrounding area, performed a full sweep of the venue, and secured all the entrances and exits to ensure nothing had been disabled, damaged, or otherwise tampered with. I hope you're starting to understand what I mean when I say those stalker types could be a proper pain in the arse. All that work, just for one single person, and we still weren't 100% satisfied once we were finished. In the end, we had to just do our best, stick to our security plan and remember our drills, and then just hope for the best. But then surprisingly, the entire evening went off without a hitch. We got the client to the venue, ensured a tertiary ring of security in addition to the venue's own staff and security, and then once all was said and done, we got her back to the hotel, safe and sound. Me and 2 other guys had agreed to do an all-nighter to keep the client's hotel floor secure. I'd been on since midday, but I fancied the overtime along with some of that fancy hotel room service for supper. The client and her crew's rooms were situated along a VIP corridor on one of the building's top floors. One man was posted on either side in a small landing area with a chair and a locked door. Then the third would patrol the corridor in the wider hotel to ensure everything was as it should be. Since the concert had come and gone without incident, we thought we'd probably be in for a quiet night, and for the most part, we were. But it only takes one hot minute for everything to change, and that night was no exception. It was around 2:30 in the morning when my colleague, who was patrolling the hotel's perimeter, gave us a call over the radio. He'd spotted a car parked in an industrial estate across the street from the hotel. He'd said he'd go and check it out and then report back on what he'd found. Then a few minutes later, he radioed us again saying that the car looked empty and it was kind of giving him bad vibes. Me and my colleague inside started getting a bit antsy, and I started to suspect our night wasn't going to be so quiet after all. Next, our colleague radioed to say that there was a lump in the back seat, covered in blankets, and it looked like a person was sleeping under them. I immediately start thinking that it's our person of interest, either hiding after spotting my colleague's approach, or getting a few hours of sleep before moving on the hotel in the pre-dawn hours. So, when my colleague starts walking away from the vehicle, I suggest just tapping on the glass to make sure it's not Walker the Stalker and just some overnight driver on a long journey getting a few hours of kip so they're safe for the drive again. And right as I suggest that, the lift dings open in front of me, and a member of hotel staff walks out pushing a trolley. I saw a younger man in his hotel uniform with close-cropped hair, so I waved him past as I listened intently to my earpiece, awaiting my colleague's response. The young man kind of nodded nervously, then carried on pushing what looked like a laundry trolley towards the VIP corridor. A second or two later, my colleague started telling us how he suddenly didn't think it was a person anymore. He didn't know what it was under those blankets, but it hadn't so much as twitched when he'd knocked as hard as he could on the rear passenger window. He was also so close that it didn't look so much like the shape of a sleeping person anymore, meaning the car wasn't occupied. It was empty. So right away, we're in a bad situation because we had an empty, unaccounted-for vehicle within what we called our primary ring of security. We had an unknown element in the area, meaning that we had to switch on and stay focused. Then right as I'm putting my game face on, I noticed something about the trolley-pushing member of hotel staff in front of me. Naturally, having pushed his laundry trolley over to the door, he was now trying to access the VIP corridor using his keycard, only the keycard wasn't working. I wasn't too concerned at first. I know for myself that kind of tech isn't always reliable, but what I did notice was this young member of staff's switch to a second keycard and then what looked like a third, all to have them rejected by the little scanner. I start watching him get more and more frustrated and more nervous before asking him if he needed any help. It wasn't a genuine offer, just something to make him turn and look at me, and then when he did, he looked scared out of his mind. I was just about to ask him if he was a wee bit starstruck at the idea of meeting a big celebrity. Again, not a genuine sentiment, just something to engage him so I get the measure of the man, and that's when I realized who it was. His hair was short, very short, but poorly shorn, almost like he'd done it to himself with very little experience. And then once I'd pieced that little detail together, I recognized his face. He'd cut his hair short, and he'd taken out his facial piercings too. But I recognized who it was. It was Walker the Stalker, in full hotel uniform, and he was standing right in front of me. In the UK, it is highly illegal for personal protection officers to carry any kind of lethal weapon. It's also very illegal for us to carry non-lethal options too, so carrying things like stun guns, pepper spray, or batons are going to land you with a criminal record. I'm sure a lot of you are going to be tearing your hair out at the mere description, asking, then how are you supposed to defend yourselves? Well, firstly, bulletproof and stab-proof vests are an option we regularly employ, and since we're not allowed to carry weapons, there's a heavy emphasis on martial arts training, particularly judo and jiu-jitsu. But there are certain products which exist in a kind of legal loophole, things that are specifically designed to circumvent the rather strict UK laws regarding self-defense. And one such item was the non-toxic dye spray that I had on a keychain in my pocket. It operates in an identical manner as pepper spray, but instead of deterring your attacker via a shower of stinging vapor, it basically involves spraying a non-toxic, fast-degrading paint in their eyes to temporarily blind them. I've used it once before, and it was just as effective as I thought it was going to be. But like a lot of the stuff like that, it's only effective when it works, and whether or not it works depends on who you're using it on, as well as the situation at hand. For example, when I realized it was Walker the Stalker in front of me, having shaved his head and removed his piercings, I told him to stop what he was doing, step back into the lift, and leave before I called the police. But Walker the Stalker didn't like that idea, and he attempted to argue his case with a zombie knife he'd clearly hidden in the laundry trolley he'd somehow acquired. I don't know if the term's made it over to the United States yet or anywhere else, but here in the UK, the term zombie knife refers to large knives or miniature machetes that are often curved, spiked, or otherwise unconventionally shaped. Walker the Stalker produces one, charges me with it, but I'm ready to deploy my dye spray, and when I did, I unleashed a powerful stream of it right into his angry little face. The reaction was instant. He was blinded, which he clearly found unpleasant, but it only made him angrier. On top of that, he knew exactly where I was too, so as he recommenced his charge and I tried to get out of the way, the landing proved too narrow, and he connected with a swing of his knife. If it wasn't for my stab vest, I would 100% be a dead man right now, because the blade connected with my chest, but slid down the fabric of the vest after cutting through my shirt. But what made me doubly fortunate was that Walker's first strike had thrown him completely off balance. This gave me an ample opportunity to subdue him, but Walker was slippery. He managed to twist out of the hold I was trying to put him in and bring up that zombie knife again. Under any other circumstances, it wouldn't have been an issue because I had him from the back, but the curved section of the blade was long enough to reach back and cut into my forehead. Another swing, and he could have had my eye out, so I shoved him forward, backed away, then keyed the emergency button on my radio to silently call in all available assistance. I had a colleague come running down from the opposite end of the hallway, which in turn alerted the light sleepers on the VIP corridor that something was going on. He came running like a bat out of hell, and all the corridor behind him started to fill up with frightened VIPs. But there were a few grim seconds there where I was alone with a very blind, but still very dangerous stalker. He was screaming and waving the zombie knife around, but the fact that he was temporarily blinded meant that he kept swinging at nothing, and then retreating from nothing and again and again. This was obviously very good for me, but his erratic swings in the shape of the knife meant rushing him would be a huge risk without someone else present. Luckily, my colleague was at my side in mere seconds, and after hurling a potted plant at the blinded Walker, we were able to tackle and subdue him while isolating the arm that he was carrying the blade with. Hotel security was there to assist within minutes, and the police were there a short while after that. Walker the Stalker was taken into custody, and while everyone was a bit shaken, It all amounted to a job well done. But what's never been properly explained to any of us was how he got his hands on that hotel uniform, as well as the key cards he was using to access various spaces. Walker didn't talk to the police. He didn't enter a plea at his trial either, and he refused to leave his cell to attend to his sentencing hearing. He never said a single word to anyone about anything, and the only clues to his motivations were the things he'd posted online. Obviously, he put a lot of time and effort into his little plan. Touring artists post their dates 18 months in advance sometimes, giving creeps like Walker plenty of time to craft their little schemes. But how he'd managed to find the exact hotel our client was staying in was tradecraft even professionals like me could admire, even if we did so begrudgingly. And if his keycard scheme had worked, God knows how he managed to program them, he might have made it all the way to a VIP room completely unchecked. Because again, radically changing his appearance prior to striking was a deviously impressive bit of deception. I feel like this is best ended by circling back to my point about how just one single person can cause an awful lot of trouble for an awful lot of people. I suppose I should take a bit of comfort in that, because if that wasn't the case, people like me would be out of a job. But it still sends shivers down my spine knowing there's many more out there, just like Walker, and not all of them are going to fail. On the evening of April 26, 2013, a 25-year-old mother of one named Jessica Heeringa was working the late-night shift at the Exxon gas station on Sternberg Road in Norton Shores, Michigan. The small, unassuming station was a familiar stop for locals, and Jessica, known for her warm smile and dedication to her job, was working alone. At the time, such working practices were a common occurrence at the Exxon. Norton Shores has a very low crime rate when compared with the rest of the state, and with the nearby Fruitford Police Department being just a few minutes' drive away, the Exxon employees felt safe enough to work alone and unarmed, Jessica included. Just prior to 11, one of the station's regulars pulled his car into the forecourt, turned off the engine, and then walked inside to make a purchase. Upon entering, he saw no one at the counter, and under the assumption the clerk was taking a bathroom break, he decided to wait. But when minutes went by and nothing but an eerie silence could be heard from the back of the store, he began to grow concerned. Seeing as he was warmly familiar with the gas station and its staff, and after suspecting an emergency was going on, the regular customer decided to step behind the counter and take a look around. In the back of the store, he found Jessica Heeringa's purse, her jacket, and other personal belongings, but no Jessica. After calling out her name a few times and walking around the store to make sure she wasn't close by, the station's regular called the cops. Minutes later, an officer arrived from the nearby department and began inspecting the gas station. There were no signs of any struggle, which suggested Jessica had simply walked out of the store for some reason, possibly with the contents of the cash register. But when the officer opened it up, all $400 in change sat there neat and untouched. The same could be said for the station's safe, but if nothing in the store had been touched and all of Jessica's belongings had been left behind, then where was she? Jessica was more than just a gas station clerk. She was a devoted mother to her beloved 3-year-old son, Zevin, and was engaged to her doting fiancé, Dakota Quayle Dyer. She was described by friends and family as kind-hearted and ambitious, and dreamed of becoming an accountant while paying her way through college. As you can imagine, this made her a very popular figure among Norton Shores residents, so her sudden disappearance sent shockwaves through a close-knit community unaccustomed to such chilling and unexpected events. Her family, particularly her mother, Shelley Heeringa, were devastated. "I know she's out there, and I know she's waiting for us to find her," she told one local journalist. "I just want my baby back. It's like a nightmare that you don't wake up from. You just want answers." Dakota Quayle Dyer, Jessica's fiancé, also spoke to local media at a vigil held in the aftermath of her disappearance. "I just want her to come home. I miss her, and our son misses her," he said. "Every day is hard, and we're not giving up. She's out there somewhere." The Norton Shores Police Department launched an immediate investigation, but to their frustrations, the lack of physical evidence at the scene posed significant challenges. As we've mentioned, there were no signs of a struggle inside the gas station, but shockingly, police found a complete absence of interior surveillance cameras at the property, meaning none of the footage could explain what happened to Jessica. They were stunned, but when asked why they'd chosen not to cover the interior of the building, its owner said they didn't think such intense surveillance was required. Obviously, it was far too late to do anything but reprimand their naivety, but it proved a shocking level of ineptitude that made the investigation infinitely more difficult. Instead of relying on security camera footage, police turned to other methods of tracking Jessica's movements. A canine unit was deployed to track her scent, but the trail ended abruptly, suggesting that she may have been taken away in a vehicle. A small spot of blood was then found outside the station's back door, and when this was confirmed to be a match for Jessica, it proved a worrying indication of potentially fatal foul play. The police then conducted interviews with customers and employees alike, and were once again shocked to learn that a young female had been left to work alone and was therefore extremely vulnerable to late-night predators. With the lack of solid evidence, police prepared themselves for the difficult job ahead, but as days turned into weeks, the investigation ground to a complete standstill. Extensive searches of the surrounding area were conducted, including wooded regions and nearby lakes. But despite numerous civilian volunteers joining law enforcement in their efforts, no trace of Jessica was ever found. In an inspiring display of community spirit, the people of Norton Shores rallied together, organizing vigils, distributing flyers, and plastering the city with missing person posters. Local media covered the case relentlessly, and Jessica's story gained the attention of national TV shows like Disappeared. Yet with no witnesses to attest to what had happened and no significant leads, the case grew cold, leaving Jessica's family in an agonizing limbo, unsure if she was alive or dead. For nearly 3 years, the question of what happened to Jessica was a haunting puzzle that weighed heavily on the people of Norton Shores. But in 2016, a seemingly unrelated incident provided the spark that would reignite her case. On April 16th, a 16-year-old girl reported being the victim of a terrifying abduction attempt in Muskegon County. She described being approached by a man in a silver minivan who then tried luring her into his vehicle. Her quick thinking allowed her to escape, and she was able to provide police with critical details, including a description of the suspect in his van. The girl's report led investigators to a man named Jeffrey Willis, a 46-year-old factory worker, but despite having no criminal history to speak of, Mr. Willis was far from innocent. During a search of Willis's home and silver Chrysler minivan, police officers unearthed a frightening amount of highly disturbing evidence. Not only did Willis's van match descriptions from witnesses, who reported seeing a similar vehicle near the Exxon station on the night Jessica disappeared, but its contents were enough to chill the blood of even the most veteran officer. Handcuffs, ropes, chains, and leather restraints proved merely the tip of the iceberg. Willis claimed all these items were perfectly legal, as were the handgun, the insulin, the Viagra, and the plastic gloves police discovered. But what was not so easy to explain was the folder on Willis's laptop that he'd simply titled Vicks. Upon opening the folder, digital forensics experts noticed the two subfolders, one titled JLH and the other titled RB. Then, after opening the RB folder, experts found photographs of a woman named Rebecca Bletch. On Sunday, June 29th of 2014, a fellow jogger discovered Rebecca's lifeless body on a regular route, less than a mile from her home near Muskegon County's Automobile Road. And while she was originally thought to be the victim of a hit and run, investigators soon discovered that Becky had been shot 3 times in the back of the head. Rebecca's loved ones were devastated by her murder, but they held out hope that justice would one day come. Willis's arrest and the seizure of his laptop marked the end of that wait. Not only did Willis's Vicks folder contain a multitude of photographs that Rebecca herself uploaded to social media, but it also contained thousands of torture and snuff videos, revealing a disturbing and deeply seated obsession with violent fantasies. But perhaps even more disturbing was a small detail regarding the folder titled JLH, because in addition to containing dozens of photographs depicting Jessica hearing a the date of its creation was April 26, 2013, the very same day that Jessica disappeared. Naturally, Jeff Willis became the prime suspect in Jessica's disappearance, as in addition to what was found on his laptop, surveillance footage from a nearby business captured his silver minivan speeding away from the Sternberg Road Exxon at around 11 p.m. on the night in question. Additionally, a police sketch, created from descriptions of a suspicious man spotted near the station that night, bore a striking resemblance to Willis, while it was later uncovered that the suspect had a lengthy history of harassing vulnerable females at their places of work. Witnesses who had earlier reported nothing suspicious on the night of Jessica's disappearance later recalled Willis as a regular customer at the Exxon. Most saw nothing but bothersome attempts at flirtation, but it made Jessica feel deeply uneasy all the same. Finally, on September 20th of 2016, Jeff Willis was officially charged with Jessica Heeringa's kidnap and murder. Prosecutors accused him of abducting her from the gas station before transporting her to his grandfather's vacant house. There, Jessica was subjected to a series of sadistic brutalities before she was executed with the same .357 Taurus found in Willis's van. The gun's serial number was partially filed off, but forensic analysts were easily able to link it to Willis through a series of DNA tests, while the JLH file on his computer, along with the bondage equipment and snuff videos police recovered, painted a chilling picture of a monster who meticulously planned his murders. In a shocking turn of events, Willis's cousin, a former correctional officer by the name of Kevin Bloom, admitted he'd helped dispose of Jessica's body after being shown her remains in his cousin's basement. And it was Bloom's latent cooperation that proved critical to the case against his cousin. In May of 2018, Willis was tried for Jessica's murder, although it should be noted that he was already serving life without parole for his 2017 conviction for the killing of Rebecca Bletch. However, in Jessica's case, the prosecution faced a unique challenge. Since Jessica's body has never been found, it became a no-body murder case, which legal experts everywhere agree are notoriously difficult to prove. But at least the sheer volume of circumstantial evidence was positively overwhelming. Willis's silver minivan, his VIX folder, along with the surveillance footage and witness testimony, all pointed to his irrefutable guilt. But on top of that, one of Willis's coworkers testified that he actually boasted of his knowledge of corpse disposal following a lengthy period of research, something the jury found very damning indeed. Willis's defense team argued that the lack of physical evidence, such as Jessica's DNA being found in his residence or on his clothing, created substantial reasonable doubt. They also suggested alternative theories to explain Jessica's disappearance, including the possibility that she'd vanished voluntarily due to dissatisfaction with her job and relationships. However, the jury found the prosecution's case so compelling that it took just an hour and a half of deliberation to find Willis guilty of kidnapping and first-degree murder. The news that he'd been sentenced to life in prison was met with tears of relief from Jessica's family, who had endured years of pain and uncertainty. Yet despite the conviction, one agonizing question remained. Where was Jessica's body? Kevin Bloom, who pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact, claimed he helped Willis bury her in a wooded area near Sheridan and Laketon Roads. He led police to several locations, but to their disappointment, extensive searches, including excavations and cadaver dog sweeps, yielded no results. Having clearly expected his cousin to rat him out, Willis had the foresight to dig up Jessica's remains before moving them to a second location. After that, all Bloom could do was give the police his best guesses, and after compiling a list of potential burial sites, over a dozen were investigated from rural properties to abandoned lots, but sadly, Jessica's remains were never found. Shelley Heeringa, Jessica's mother, had spoken publicly about the pain of not knowing where her daughter is, but has vowed to continue the search. Local volunteers have also refused to give up the ghost, and driven by a collective desire to bring Jessica home, have since organized efforts to comb through potential burial sites. Jessica's disappearance not only had a profound impact on the residents of Norton Shores, but it also exposed the glaring vulnerabilities in workplace safety for late-night workers. In response, Michigan lawmakers signed the Jessica Heeringa Act into law in 2016, which mandates enhanced safety measures for gas stations and convenience stores, such as requiring multiple employees on late shifts, installing panic buttons, and ensuring full 24/7 surveillance. The local community also continues to honor Jessica through annual vigils and fundraisers for her son, Zevon, who is being raised by his father and grandmother in the wake of her loss. Jessica's murder robbed Norton Shores of its innocence and serves as a reminder of how devastating violent crime can be. But it also gives us many reasons to be hopeful. Whether it be the courage of the 16-year-old who escaped a similarly grisly fate, the dedication of investigators, or the resilience of Jessica's family, there are many such examples of good people pushing back against the darkness. But Jessica's absence and the failure to bring home her remains leave an open wound. Jeff Willis, now serving multiple life sentences, remains completely unrepentant and has offered no further clues to Jessica's whereabouts. Perhaps one day he will, but until then, the memory of the incident remains a somber chapter in Norton Shores history. It's a testament to the pain of unresolved loss, but it's also a testament to the strength of those who refuse to give up. I've been working as a security guard at this factory complex in Detroit for about 6 months now. It's not the best job, but it pays okay and keeps the bills covered. I sit most of the time watching cameras, making sure nobody's sneaking around where they don't belong. It's quiet most nights, just me and a bunch of empty buildings. I've been doing the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. since I started. It's rough on sleep, but I manage. The factory's an old place, used to make auto parts back in the day. Most of it's empty now, just a few buildings still running. And at night, it's all shadows and echoes, with rats scurrying around sometimes. I start my shift checking the doors, making sure they're locked up tight, and then I settle into the security office, sipping coffee and watching the camera feeds. Every couple of hours, I do a walk around, shine my flashlight into the dark corners, and to be honest, it's boring, but it's money. But one night, though, everything went bad. It was cold, Michigan cold, the kind that gets into your bones, and I was on my third cup of coffee feeling tired because I hadn't slept good the day before. And I was staring at the screens when I saw something on camera 3 out by the back loading dock. It looked like a shadow moving, quick, sneaky, and I leaned closer, squinting, but it was too dark to tell. I remember thinking at first that it could have been nothing, but I saw it again, darting across the feed. And I just kind of sighed, grabbed my flashlight and my jacket and headed out. The factory's a maze at night, big old buildings with alleys between them. I shined my light around, checking the loading dock. The door was shut, no sign of anyone breaking in, and then I walked over to the fence and saw it was intact with no holes. I figured maybe it was just wind blowing trash around and I was about to head back when I heard something, like a snicker, real quiet. I froze, listening hard, and then out of the shadows, they came at me. There were 4 or 5 of them, all wearing masks like Halloween or something like that, and they were younger. I could tell by how they moved, very jumpy and full of energy, like kids hyped up on sugar. One of them shoved me hard and I stumbled back, almost dropping my flashlight, and before I could even really work out what was happening, another one of them punched me in the gut so hard it knocked the wind out of me. I doubled over gasping, and then they were all on me, hitting and kicking like a pack of wild animals. I tried to fight back, even swung my flashlight at one of them, but they were too fast. Someone grabbed it and tossed it away before another kid punched me in the face, and I felt my nose crack and I could feel blood starting to come down. I could taste it in my sinuses. I tried to yell, but they kept hitting me, knocking me off my feet over and over. Someone kicked my legs out and I went down hard, pain shooting through my knees and hands as I hit the gravel. But they didn't stop there. Kicks landed on my ribs, my back, my arms. I curled up, trying to cover my head, but it didn't do much good. The pain was everywhere and I could hear them laughing, loud and crazy like it was some type of game. It was sick the way they enjoyed it, They acted like kids, but mean ones. The kind that'd pull wings off of flies just to watch them squirm. And that scared me more than the pain. The way they didn't care, the way they seemed to like it. And this went on for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been. And finally one of them smashed me in the head, and that's really when everything went black. Just a sudden nothing, like someone flipped a switch. And when I woke up, it was still dark and still cold. I was laying on the ground, my face pressed into the gravel, my head was pounding and my mouth still tasted like blood. I tried to move, but my whole body screamed at me. My ribs felt like they were burning and my hands wouldn't work right, and I spat out blood and some pieces of my teeth. They'd messed me up bad. I didn't know how long I'd been out. Those kids were gone, no sign of them. My clothes were torn and my shoes were missing. I must have taken them. Air Jordans, 96. I felt for my wallet and it was still in my pocket. Guess they didn't want money, just wanted to hurt me. I got to my feet, slow and shaky, dizzy as hell, and every step hurt, but I leaned against the wall and started stumbling back to the office. I kept tripping, my legs weak, my ribs stabbing me with every breath, but finally I made it to the security office, fell into the chair and grabbed the phone. My hands were shaking so bad I could hardly dial 911. I mumbled something about being attacked, gave them the address, and then I just sat there, waiting, trying not to pass out again. The paramedics showed up pretty quickly. The lights were flashing and they loaded me onto a stretcher, and they asked me what happened, but my jaw hurt way too much to even really talk at that point. They took me to the hospital and I spent a few days there, all bandaged up. Doc said that I had broken ribs, a concussion, fractures in my fingers, and a busted up face. They even pulled out some teeth and gave me some painkillers and said that I was lucky that it wasn't worse. But I didn't feel very lucky though. The cops came by while I was resting, and two of them, one older guy and one younger. They asked me to describe the attackers, but I didn't have much to give. Masks covered their faces and it was dark. I told them they were young, fast, laughing like maniacs, but that was it. They wrote it down and said they'd look into it, but I don't think I ever heard from them again. I guess I knew they wouldn't find those kids. There are too many shadows in Detroit to hide in. And after a few days, they let me go home. I was still hurting, and I couldn't do much but sit around. Couldn't work, that's for sure. I had 2 kids depending on me, and I didn't know how I was going to pay those bills. My daughter, she's 8, cried when she saw me all banged up. My son, 12, tried to act tough, but I could tell he was shook. I told them that I had an accident at work and didn't want them to be scared knowing the actual truth. My sister helped out, coming over with food and changing my bandages, and she's a nurse, so she did know what to do. I hated needing her like that though, but I couldn't manage alone. Getting out of bed was a fight every day. My ribs ached, my hands didn't grip right with those broken fingers, and I felt useless, like I couldn't even take care of myself, let alone my kids. I kept thinking about that night over and over. Why'd they do it? Just for kicks? I ain't never hurt nobody, and I only was just doing my job. It just didn't make any sense. My boss called and said that they were sorry it happened, said they'd add more security, maybe another guard, and it didn't make me feel much better. The other guards, when I finally went back, clapped me on the shoulder and said that they were glad I was okay, but I saw the worry in their eyes. Nobody wanted to think it could be them next. The cops never caught those kids and probably never will. And it tears me up to think that they got away clean and I'm stuck with these scars. It just ain't right, but what can I do? Life ain't fair, I guess. And I'm more careful now, always looking around expecting trouble. And maybe that's good, keeps me sharp. But it also showed me how quick things can go bad and how you can't always stop it. I just keep going, for my kids, for myself. And I guess there ain't no other choice. The creepiest, most frightening story I know didn't come from a John Carpenter movie or a Stephen King book. It came from a little old lady that I met out on a hike one day out near Cross Timbers Park here in Kansas. I was in my late 30s, and hiking had become my way of taking a break from the daily grind. I liked the quiet, the way it cleared my head and kept me grounded. So, one warm afternoon in late spring, I decided to drive up to the state park to hit the trails and work off some stress. That day, the park was dead silent, and I felt like I was the only one around for miles. I'd been walking for a couple of hours following a trail near the edge of the park that wound past little clearings when I stumbled onto something I wasn't expecting. In a small meadow surrounded by trees with the late afternoon sunlight poking through them, I found 4 graves. The headstones were old and beat up, leaning a bit like they were worn out from standing there so long. I got closer, brushing away some tall grass to read them. The names were faded and tough to make out, but I could tell they were all from the same family, brothers and a father it looked like. There was nothing weird about family being buried right next to each other, especially back then. But the thing that really caught my eye and sent a little shiver down my spine was how they all had the same date of death, April 7th of 1859. I remember standing there staring at those stones, wondering what could have taken out a whole family in just one day. Was it a sickness of some kind, maybe some kind of accident, or was it something darker? My curiosity got going, and I couldn't help but hang around trying to figure it out. Then as I was poking around the graves, I heard footsteps crunching behind me. I turned and saw a woman walking across the meadow towards me. She looked to be in her late 50s, and without trying to sound mean, she didn't look like she took care of herself too good. She looked sharp, though, and had this serious, determined look in her eyes as she approached. She asked why I was trespassing on her land, and when I assured her that I didn't mean to and I was just interested in the graves, she softened up on me a little. I told her I was just hiking through the park, and I guess I just strayed off the trail a little too far, and then I told her my name and said it was a pleasure to meet her. And that made her smile, and after telling me her name was Martha, she said she was the great-great-granddaughter of one of the men buried there. Hearing that was kind of exciting, I guess, because it meant that there was a chance that she knew what happened to them. Then when I asked, as delicately as possible by the way, it almost seemed like she'd been waiting for someone to show some interest in them. Without me asking too much, she launched into the story of her doomed forefathers, a tale her family had passed down for years, and let me tell you, that juice was well worth the squeeze. She started by explaining the times her great-great-grandfather lived in. They called it Bleeding Kansas back then, a messy, violent period when people were fighting over whether Kansas would be a free state or a slave state, and her great-great-grandfather, a guy named Ezekiel, found his family caught up in that. And back then, the state of Kansas was flooded with weaponry. The New England Emigrant Aid Company would send what appeared to be crates of Bibles to the Free Staters, but the crates were actually filled with Sharps rifles, or what they called Beecher's Bibles back then. The slavers got shipments too, mostly from pro-slavery supporters from Missouri, but also from sympathizers in the wider South. It was like a practice round for the Civil War, which came a few years after, and it was also complete chaos too. So a lot of those shipments I mentioned there didn't make it into the hands of those they were intended for. Which brings me nicely to the fly-by-night firearm traders that were roaming around, selling stolen or misplaced weapons to anyone with a few bucks to buy them. Ezekiel, I was told, had gone into the woods one day to meet one such rifle salesman. He wanted rifles and shotguns to keep his family safe from the slavers that might raid his family farm, but since he didn't have the time to ride all the way into Colleyville or Toronto to visit an established gun store, he took a chance with the man in the woods. But after heading out into the trees, poor old Ezekiel never made it back home. His father and brother started to get worried about him, so off they went into the woods to find him. But then instead of bringing home their kin alive and well, all they found was his body. Zeke wasn't just dead either. He was torn up real bad, mutilated like something unholy had been done to him. Martha said she was told that it looked like some kind of ritual, though she'd never been told the gorier details. I could picture it though, at least in my imagination, and boy did it give me the creeps. As you can imagine, Zeke's family didn't just let it go. and they swore a terrible and bloody revenge against the people who murdered him. They heard a guy in the next town over was selling rifles in the exact same way, as in organizing meetups in the woods. So Ezekiel's pa and brothers rode out there to track him down. They asked around, got the townsfolk to tell them where the salesman was hiding, and then headed into the woods to get revenge. But just like Ezekiel, they didn't come back. A couple of days later, someone found their horses tied to some trees near an old wooden church that had been left to rot. A search party went out, found the falling down church, and then they searched the place to rule out the missing men being inside. But when they stepped inside, there they were, lying on the rotted wood planks with the bodies of Ezekiel's father and brothers. It appeared they'd shot each other dead, but no one could figure out why or how it happened. Martha said the county sheriff got called in, who brought his bloodhounds to the church. The dogs sniffed out the trails of the 3 dead men, but there was a 4th scent, someone they couldn't identify. The sheriff and his deputies then followed the 4th trail through the woods until it led to an old cave. But the bloodhounds, who were usually bold as brass, wouldn't go near it. They just whimpered and backed off like they were scared of whoever or whatever was inside. The deputies checked it out anyway, but all they found were some old clothes and animal bones. There was no sign of the 4th person. I remember how, when she got to that part of the story, Martha stopped talking for a few moments as her gaze wandered off, like she was seeing that cave in her mind's eye. And then she told me what she thought happened, and theory or not, what she said sent a chill through me. When she said she believed her forefathers ran into the devil himself, she was dead serious. She believed this thing of evil tricked them into killing each other by feeding them lies. She thought about it long and hard, and she couldn't think of anything else that properly explained it. Her forefathers were good men, she said, but that's all they were, men. Martha then quoted a Bible verse about how men were vulnerable to the devil's ways, saying, "Many a victim has he laid low, and all his slain are a mighty throng." I wasn't sure what to think. I asked if there could have been another explanation, or if there was some kind of family feud she didn't know about. She just shook her head and said that she knows the devil walks the earth, looking for people who are weak or angry. Her family was both, she reckoned, grieving Ezekiel and out for blood. According to her, it made them easy pickings. I didn't argue with her. I could see she believed it with all her heart, and honestly, the story was heavy enough without me trying to poke holes in it. 4 guys from one family, all gone in such a brutal way. Devil or no devil, it was pretty messed up. And we stood there by the graves for a while, not saying much of anything, just taking everything in. And then, as the sun started to go down, I thanked her for telling me the story, and she gave me this small, sad smile in response. She said it mattered to keep their memory alive, that they didn't deserve what happened to them. I nodded in agreement, thanked her for the story, and then said my goodbyes and got back on the trail. I tried to focus my mind elsewhere, trying to figure out how long it'd take before I was back home and preparing dinner. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about Martha's story, and the more I thought about it, the more the woods didn't quite feel the same anymore. Before, they'd been peaceful, but then it felt like they were hiding something. In the days that followed, I thought about Ezekiel heading into the woods to buy those guns, just trying to keep his family safe in a crazy time. I also thought about his father and brothers, torn up over losing him, and then going after the guy they thought did it. Something went very, very wrong in that church. Something bad enough for them to turn their guns on each other, but how? Was it the salesman? Did he mess with their heads somehow? Or was it something else? Something more in line with what Martha said about them dealing with the devil. That cave part nagged at me too. Who was that 4th person? Was the salesman working alone, or was there someone else involved? And why the hell did those dogs freak out so much? Those old clothes and the animal bones had to be a clue too, but to what? I had no idea. Maybe the rifle salesman was a crook, luring people to rob them, or worse. And then he could have set up Ezekiel's family somehow and got them to fight each other. But that didn't explain the cave or the dogs acting spooked, not to mention Ezekiel's body being all cut up like it was. That made it sound more like the work of some bloodthirsty lunatic than a straight-up robbery. Martha's devil idea was way out there, but I understood why she chose to believe it. Back then, with all the chaos and death, people probably saw the devil everywhere. He was an easy way to explain the unexplainable. Personally, I wasn't sold on it, but I couldn't shake that idea. And even now, I sometimes find myself picturing it in my head. Ezekiel meeting that salesman, the family finding his body, the shootout in the church, and the cave with its secrets. I didn't have answers, and maybe I never would. But that connection to the past, those lives lost in a place I just walked through, it hit me hard. And that was enough to keep me thinking about it for a long, long time. During the summer of 2013, when we were in our mid-20s, my friend Rachel asked if I wanted to join her, her boyfriend, and a couple of his friends on a camping trip up in the Catskills. It was shaping up to be a really nice, dry summer, and I knew her boyfriend and his buddies were chill, so I think anyone would have found the invitation nice. But for me personally, I was way beyond stoked for the prospect of going on my first ever camping trip, and the reason it was my first stems from a time in my life that I don't even remember anymore. I'm getting the story secondhand from my mom, who to this day is furious that my dad let this happen, but here goes. When I was just 3 years old, some of my dad's old college friends asked if he wanted to join them for a few hours of barbecuing up in one of New York's state parks. He did, and this resulted in toddler me accompanying him. But apparently, while Dad and his buddies were flipping ribeyes and talking trash, yours truly went off for a little unsanctioned wander. Then when Dad and his friends realized that I'd wandered off, they went into a total panic. They went running around the park like men possessed trying to find me, and when they finally did, I was wailing so loud that they heard me long before they saw me. I didn't drop it either. I was still mad when he got me back home, which is how Mom found out that he'd almost lost me during a barbecue trip to the woods with friends. And that was that. Mom developed this general anxiety about me being near any kind of forest or wooded area, like the whole thing had given her some irrational fear. And this meant no hiking, no camping, and most definitely no summer camp. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why I was so stoked to get that invitation. Eventually, Rachel and her boyfriend decided that we'd head up to a place called Papacton Reservoir for a long weekend. Papacton was 12 miles away from the nearest town, but with Highway 30 running all along its southern shore, it was nicely accessible with a couple of cabins and campgrounds, but still secluded enough to feel wild. At least to a bunch of city people it felt wild, but to us, wild meant fun. We drove up towards the end of July with the 5 of us packed into Rachel's old Honda, and we drove until we found a little peninsula with a parking lot, campground, and a boat launch. There were a couple of cabins on the opposite side of the highway, but apart from that, there was nothing but the reservoir, the highway, and what looked like endless woodland beyond. We stuck to our little peninsula for a while, unloading the car and setting up camp, and then after a campfire dinner of beans and hot dogs, we had a few beers as the sun went down and then headed to our sleeping bags. The next morning, we headed down to the shore in ones and twos to get an early morning rinse, and then as the boys occupied themselves skimming stones across the water, me and Rachel decided to explore the other side of the highway. I was excited to explore the woods. I mean, it felt like this whole other magical world to me, even being as old as I was. But our little walk served another purpose too. As we walked up and down a short dirt road lined with mostly empty cabins, Rachel told me all about how baby crazy she was getting. She wanted to start a family while she was still in her prime childbearing years, she said, but her boyfriend didn't seem anywhere near ready for that kind of responsibility. Apparently, they'd talked it over and Rachel wanted to stop taking her birth control, but she wouldn't until her boyfriend started taking the whole thing seriously. He claimed he was, she thought he wasn't, and we just kept on talking about the whole thing as we walked away from the cabins and further into the woods. Since I had this irrational fear of getting lost in the woods, or not so irrational given my history, I had my compass with me and Rachel kept poking fun because I was almost constantly checking our direction. I made some joke about how since she was so worried about the direction her relationship was taking, then it was down to me to worry about the direction of our hike. And she just rolled her eyes as I laughed a little, but after a few more minutes of walking, I wasn't really laughing anymore. I remember stopping dead in the middle of a trail and then turning very quiet. Rachel asked what had gotten into me, but I couldn't answer. I wanted to, but the words wouldn't come out, and when I finally was able, this is what I told her. Around the time I started middle school, I started having these reoccurring nightmares. Mom thought that they were some kind of belated trauma response to getting lost in those woods when I was still little, while Dad thought that they were some manifestation of my concerns with starting a new school. I had no idea why I was having them. I just know that it was hell waking up every night with my sheets soaked with cold sweat. I've been walking through the woods, like dark fairy tale woods, all these twisted roots and branches with no leaves, and then I come across a small stone house. It was so small that it couldn't have been more than one room inside, and the inside looked completely dark, like whatever was in there was swallowing up all the light. In that nightmare, I'd want to run away, but I couldn't. It was like my feet had grown roots and kept me glued to the spot as something shuffled into view from the edges of my vision. It was a creature, with skin like tree bark and hair like flames. Then, as it staggered towards the little stone house, it would always smile at me before walking into the darkness inside, and it was that smile which used to scare the living hell out of me. The creature had blood all over its teeth and dripping down its chin, like it had just eaten one little girl and still had room for another. But then instead of dragging me inside, the creature just turned its back and walked into the dark, but I still had this feeling of absolute dread gripping me, because in my nightmare I knew that sooner or later, I'd walk into the darkness all on my own, whether I wanted to or not, and the creature would be waiting for me. I'm sure a lot of you can now understand why I was so frightened by that nightmare, especially since I used to have it at least 2 or 3 times a week for almost 2 years. Mom ended up organizing a visit to a child psychologist, but nothing she advised seemed to help. And then one day, when I was a high school sophomore, the nightmares just kind of stopped. The psychologist said it was just the natural progression of things, and the sudden end to the nightmares was probably due to me feeling much more settled at school. I was so happy that I'd stopped having them that I didn't really care why I'd stopped having them. And then over the years that followed, reminders of the dream became less and less frequent. Then with the stresses of high school, it faded to the back of my mind. And that's where they stayed too, for maybe 7 or 8 years, until I was walking through the woods, and it all came flooding back to me. And the reason it came flooding back was because it felt like the exact same scenery as my nightmare from all those years before. It wasn't a debilitating kind of shock I was feeling, like I didn't break down crying or start begging to turn back, but having that sensation hit me right between the eyes, having it all look so uncanny, it was definitely a freaky experience. Rachel, on the other hand, was looking at me like she didn't quite know what to say, and to be honest, I understood. We were both very rational, skeptical people averse to all things woo-woo. Then there I was, talking about an old nightmare I used to have like it was memories of a past life or something. She kept that look on her face for a moment before asking, Is everything all right with you? I was fine, at least I thought I was. Then as we kept walking, I filled her in on the whole woodland activities ban that Mom had imposed when I was a kid. I remember how Rachel laughed and said, "It's all starting to make sense now. You're basically an agoraphobic." At the time, I thought she was right. I still think she was right in a sense, it's just not the same kind of right that I first figured as we were walking through those woods. As we turned back towards camp, that weird feeling in the pit of my stomach seemed to unknot itself, and I started to enjoy myself again. I figured talking it out with Rachel had helped a bunch, and it was my first time walking through a forest in almost 20-something years, so maybe it really was just my mind playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. Something was out there, just waiting for me to find it. So we had lunch, lounged around on the shore for a couple of hours soaking up the sun, and then went for a swim to work on an appetite for dinner. Then later, while sitting around the campfire, Rachel started playfully joking about my little deja vu experience on our morning hike. It was a very good-natured attempt at humor, like she wasn't being mean or anything, but the comments sparked a wider conversation that, thanks to her boyfriend's buddies, touched on things like past lives, remote viewing, and other seemingly illogical stuff. Or at least, it seemed illogical, until I started thinking about it. Maybe it was the alcohol that got me thinking they could be right in some way, but I'd felt deja vu before, and what I felt on that hike was very, very strong. Like if deja vu was Budweiser, then what I experienced was like straight Tito's. Same ballpark, just way more intense. I woke up the next morning feeling considerably more rational, and we repeated the morning ritual of heading down to the shore with our towels, soap, and bathing suits to wash away the mental cobwebs. We then had ourselves some breakfast while we decided what to do with our Saturday, then agreed to head out into the woods on an extended hike. Since I was feeling back to my regular self again, I was super excited to get back on the trails, and the next couple of hours were just fantastic. The weather was great, Rachel's boyfriend and his buddies were great company, and perfect gentlemen really, and the trails weren't too rough or demanding for what amounted to my first real hike. We'd packed ourselves some lunch in the form of some crackers, jerky, and granola bars, and I know I drank like a metric ton of water too, because it wasn't long before I needed to use the bathroom. I was a little shy about peeing outside around others, so much so that I ended up putting at least 50 or 60 yards between me and the group before I felt comfortable enough to drop my shorts. And when I finally found a nice enough spot, I did my business, pulled up my shorts, and then kind of instinctually looked over my shoulder just to make sure that I was still alone. I looked one way, then the other, and that's when I noticed something about the treetops in the near distance, and how oddly familiar they seemed. Then the longer I looked, the more that skin-crawling feeling of deja vu came slowly creeping back. I kept telling myself I should stay put, that I was messing with some kind of mental health thing, and that I'd live to regret not being more cautious. But in the end, I just couldn't help myself. I had to know why I was feeling the way I did, and at the time, only the woods seemed like they had any answers. So I walked towards the oddly familiar treetops, the trunks of which were hidden behind a low rise, and then as I crested that, I suddenly felt myself beginning to feel faint, because what I saw was impossible. It was a small concrete structure, maybe shoulder height and just a few feet wide, with a slanted concrete roof in the shape of an inverted V. The entrance was fairly small, but it was deep enough to shroud the furthest point in a haze of darkness. I'd seen it before. It didn't look exactly the same as I remembered, but I had seen it before. Hundreds of times, in fact, in that horrible, repetitive nightmare I'd done so much to forget. And I couldn't believe it. All those years of thinking it was something my imagination had cooked up, and it had been real the whole time. I can barely explain the feeling because the structure wasn't the exact same as the one from the nightmare. It wasn't a little stone cottage with a door and a window and whatnot, but at the same time, I just sort of knew. Like it had lit up some long dormant synapse in my brain that said, we've seen this before. But if I'd seen it before, if I'd seen it in my nightmares, what about the monster I saw? The one with skin like bark and hair like fire? Being the skeptic that I am, and even though I was 99% certain that no such supernatural creature exists in the world, having the ultra-vivid feeling of deja vu had me so unsettled that, just for a moment, I found myself terrified something was about to emerge from the structure's shadows. Obviously that didn't happen, because unless you're counting grizzly bears and tigers and all of that, monsters aren't real. But curiosity drew me further and further towards that structure, until finally, I was just a few feet away from its entrance. And like I said, it went back pretty deep. So deep I couldn't see all the way in without crouching down and sort of peering inside to let my eyes adjust to the dark. And then when I did, I could see the shape of something covered up by layers of dead leaves and small branches. It felt like I was at the end of some years-long journey. I couldn't just stand up and walk away, no matter how strong the feeling of dread was, burning away inside my chest. And so I leaned in further and brushed away some of the foliage covering the shape and saw a boot. It looked old, like it had been there for years, maybe even decades, and I don't know what possessed me, but I decided to reach in and just drag it out. But when I did, and I tugged it free, I saw a length of bone come with it. I knew it wasn't just an animal bone, not because I'm some expert in anatomy or anything like that, but because of the way it shifted right as I moved the boot, like I'd disturbed something that had been resting for a very long time. I pulled back immediately as that magnetic feeling of curiosity turned to one of overwhelming repulsion, and I got up, and I ran, all the way back to Rachel and the group where I breathlessly relayed what I had just seen. I didn't say anything about my childhood nightmares or that weird feeling that I'd seen it or been there before. There was no time for anything like that because there was something very real in that strange concrete structure. I asked someone to call 911, but Rachel's boyfriend and his buddies insisted on seeing the bones before they called anyone. And I get it. I don't think they didn't believe me so much as they couldn't believe what I was telling them. I mean, we'd already kind of established that I was a total newbie when it came to hiking and camping and all of that, but when I said that I was sure that it wasn't an animal bone, I know they must have felt a hell of a lot of doubt and therefore wanted to see it for themselves. Well, we walked all the way out to the trees that I'd recognized and that weird concrete playhouse type thing. Then when they looked inside, they had almost the exact same holy crap reaction I did, and then whoever's cell phone had bars ended up calling the cops. We had to wait around for an hour or so for them to arrive, but when they did, 2 cops pulled over to the side of the highway after we waved them down. Then we walked them out to that concrete structure and where a human skeleton was partially covered in leaf litter. They took one look at it before one of them started speaking into his radio and saying how they needed all kinds of assistance to secure the crime scene and examine the remains. The cops asked us a bunch of questions while they waited for their partners to show up, but obviously no one really had anything to tell them except for me. Again, I didn't say anything about my nightmares. I just told them about finding the body after wandering off to go to the bathroom. And then after that, since we obviously weren't suspects, the cops told us that we were free to leave, but that they might be in touch. As we walked back to our camp, I felt terrible for being such a buzzkill, but I was so freaked out from finding those bones that I couldn't get myself settled in again, so I asked Rachel if it was okay to just give me a ride back home. She told me it was no problem at all, and then we kind of jointly rolled our eyes when the boys said that there was no way in hell they were leaving. They actually thought it was kind of cool that I'd found some body and wanted to hang out to see if the media showed up. And that was whatever, I guess. Boys will be boys. And Rachel hadn't mentioned what I told about my dream, and all they knew was that I got that creepy sense of deja vu, so I don't blame them for not totally understanding why I couldn't stay. But I just couldn't handle being there, and as we drove away, it felt like this huge weight was being lifted off my chest and I could breathe again. Rachel dropped me back off at my apartment and then decided that she'd stay with me overnight before driving back to the Catskills in the morning, as the boys still needed a ride back home. She must have figured that I needed someone to talk to, and I really did, because I couldn't reconcile the bizarre similarities between what I'd seen in my dream and what I'd found out in those woods. I'd never known anything to stretch my skepticism to its absolute limits, and it was not a pleasant experience. I didn't know if I was going crazy or not, and I clung to the hope that there was some kind of rational explanation for what was going on. Thankfully, it turned out there was some kind of rational explanation. I just inadvertently delayed hearing it by avoiding talking to the one person I needed to, my mother. And for reasons that should be pretty obvious by now, I had no intentions whatsoever of telling my mom about that camping trip. I didn't want to worry her or potentially start some kind of argument, so I kept my mouth shut about it, and I continued to keep my mouth shut about it for a whole 24 hours or so before I finally broke and called her. She wasn't mad that I'd gone to the Catskills. She wasn't mad that I hadn't told her either. She wasn't happy about it, but she appreciated that I was a grown woman who could make my own choices. I told her everything, from feeling weird to finding that body, and then when I was finished, she asked where exactly we'd visited, and I told her the Catskills. And after a couple of seconds of silence, she asked, where exactly? Then when I told her we were camped near that reservoir, she says, "Oh God, let me call your father. I'll get right back to you when I'm done." She called back within minutes and then told me something along the lines of, "Sweetie, I need you to brace yourself for me, but the place you went missing when you were a kid, it was up near that reservoir. The reason why it felt like you'd been there before, it's because you have." I guess these days I kind of kick myself for not putting it together sooner, but I guess it's also a testament to just how powerful the brain is in terms of filing away memories you think you've forgotten. I ended up contacting the cops who dealt with that body just to try and fill in the gaps in the story a little. They didn't know the whole story either, and at first, they weren't too excited on sharing any details with me. But when I said that I'd gotten lost in the area as a child and had these sort of weird nightmarish/memories about a monster crawling into the concrete structure, they suddenly got very interested in what I had to say. I won't go into everything that was said. It was a long and meandering conversation that touched on a lot of stuff that I've already covered, but this is the long and short of it. I'm 99% certain that I saw the person who died in that structure, which turned out to be half-finished housing for an electrical transformer or something like that, walk in there before they passed away. The cops said that they figured the guy was some hunter, because there were scraps of camouflage clothing still clinging to that skeleton's leg bones, which was probably why the monster in my dream had skin like bark. And then its hair that looked like fire. Well, you guessed it, an orange hunting cover that turned to flames in my nightmare. But what about the blood all around that creature's mouth? Well, both me and the cops figured that following some kind of severe hunting accident, the guy realized that he was dying and probably wasn't going to make it. So rather than die out in the open where his body would almost certainly be torn apart by animals, he crawled into that half-built transformer housing and then just laid down and died in the hopes that someone would end up finding him. The only thing the cops wouldn't talk to me about, and not because they didn't know it themselves, was what exactly caused the wound which killed the hunter. They knew. I'm almost certain of it because they told me they'd completed a forensics exam of the bones. They just wouldn't tell me if it was a gunshot which killed the man, which possibly indicated murder, or if the wound had been caused by something like a sharp branch or a deer's antler or something, in which case it could have been nothing more than a tragic hunting accident. I'd like to be able to say that I'd helped in some way too, but nothing I had to say did anything for the investigation other than roughly confirm the date of the man's death, which the cops already had an idea of anyways thanks to whatever they did. And I guess the only good thing that came of it for me personally was the clarity and closure I got from talking to the police. It was a relief like no other to know that I wasn't going crazy, and that I had a damn good reason for feeling so off in those woods, especially those woods where I'd been traumatized so horribly when I was still just a toddler. I can only hope that someday they figure out what happened so that poor man can finally rest in complete and everlasting peace. I grew up in a little place called Shiprock, New Mexico, which is home to the Northern Navajo Nation Fair. It rolls around every fall for a couple of days, and like most kids around there, I was taught to have a lot of pride in my people and my culture, especially when it came to the concept of our guardianship over the land. I was born back in 1957, just in time for the hippie movement to sweep the nation around the time of my 10th birthday. The long-haired day trippers over in San Francisco had declared it the Summer of Love and talked about peace, love, and harmony with nature. I could get down with the first two parts for sure, but it was the third part that really struck a chord and resonated with that sense of guardianship I too came to feel. I wanted to protect Dinata, which is the Navajo word for our homeland, and by the time I got to high school, a lot of my friends were dead set on joining the military as a way of doing just that. It was good money. It invoked the warrior spirit of our ancestors, and if you were defending the USA, then you were helping defend the Navajo too, right? I guess a lot of people thought that way, but me personally, I thought they were crazy. It was 1971 when I started high school, and by then, all the bombs, blood, and body bags I'd seen in the newsreels from Vietnam meant I had no intention whatsoever of joining up. I might not have been the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I knew that there were no Viet Cong in San Juan County. But what was in San Juan, and had been since before I was born, were a whole bunch of mining companies who didn't always play by the rules when it came to disposing of toxic waste products. I can't put it all on the mining companies. Unregulated grazing and industrial encroachment had also left scars on the land, but the mining companies had a bad reputation for a damn good reason, because the uranium mines they left abandoned had leached poison into our soil and water. They did the most damage, so to me, it was them that Dinata needed protecting from most. So instead of choosing a warrior's path, I chose a scholar's. I graduated from the University of New Mexico with a bachelor's degree in environmental science in 1975, but in between study sessions, I was volunteering with the Navajo Nation's environmental programs. Working with those programs was a work experience goldmine. Then after graduation, I heard from a professor that the EPA was hiring in Region 6, which covered my home state of New Mexico. The application process was long and tiresome, but after months of waiting, I got a call back for an interview. I wore my best bolo tie, spoke plainly about why I wanted the job, and while I leaned on my fieldwork and studies, I also made it clear that I knew the land as a Navajo, not just as a scientist. A few weeks later, I was offered a position as an environmental scientist with the EPA's Region 6 office based in New Mexico, and it was a dream come true. I started in early 1979, and while the work was challenging, every sample I took and every report I wrote was a step toward protecting our ancestral lands. I carried the weight of my ancestors' teachings, their respect for Mother Earth, into every meeting and every field assignment. But just 5 months into my job, the land that I'd sworn to protect faced a catastrophe that shook all of us to our cores. In the morning of July 16, 1979, at around 5:30 a.m., a dam at the uranium mills up in Church Rock gave way. The breach unleashed over 1,000 tons of radioactive mill tailings, which is sandy, radium-laced debris from uranium processing, and 94 million gallons of radioactive wastewater into the Puerco River, which then flowed downstream by around 80 miles through McKinley and Navajo counties. The spill was even worse than the 3 Mile Island accident which happened earlier that year, but to our shock, we barely made the news. As a Region 6 employee, I was thrown into action almost right away. I joined the teams collecting water and soil samples, and we quickly determined radiation levels in the Puerco River were over 7,000 times the level we'd considered dangerous. We put signs up warning people to avoid the river. Many Navajo families either didn't get the news or had no other choice. Goat herders, for example, were some of the worst affected. Their livestock drank from the river and later died or gave birth to deformed or inviable offspring. Then, to make matters worse, the governor refused to declare a federal disaster area, which left many Navajo communities without aid they urgently required. I knew I was needed at Church Rock, and I knew I could do some good there. So within 24 hours of returning from the testing teams, I was pushing for a transfer. I pressed my supervisors, arguing that my experience with the Navajo Nation's environmental programs made me ideal for the task. And then, in September of '79, my persistence paid off. The EPA approved my reassignment to a long-term monitoring project focused on the Church Rock area, specifically targeting the spread of radioactive contamination beyond the river into surrounding ecosystems. The assignment wouldn't be a glamorous one. There'd be long hours, limited funding, and the obvious dangers of trudging around a potentially radioactive forest all day. But it also meant an opportunity to serve Dinata directly. So without a moment's hesitation, I took it. From the fall of '79 to the winter of '81, I was based out of McGaffey, a small town in the Zuni Mountains about 20 miles south of Church Rock. My work revolved around weekly trips into the wooded area south of the spill, where its toxic plume had spread through runoff and wind. There, I'd test trees and soil for radioactive contamination, which posed long-term risks to plants, animals, and people. Every Monday, I'd load up my truck in McGaffey with sampling equipment, Geiger counter, soil corers, and containers for plant samples, then make the 20-mile drive to Church Rock past warning signs faded by the sun and dry washes still stained with a dirt yellow sediment. In the woods, I followed a grid system mapped out by my EPA colleagues, spending hours taking tree clippings and collecting soil samples to check for radioactive particles. And the results horrified me. The radiation levels in some of my soil samples were over 100 times higher than normal, and certain trees showed elevated radioactivity in their bark and needles. I documented everything, knowing the data I collected could make all the difference when it came to getting the cleanup right. It hurt knowing that I wasn't in a position to outright prevent things like that from happening in the first place, but helping drive the cleanup made me feel like I was really making a difference. I don't regret all the time that I spent helping out. I wouldn't change a thing. But let's just say that I had one or two encounters that made me think that there might be scarier things than radiation out in those woods. You see, in the fall of 1980, about a year into my weekly trips into the woods south of Church Rock, I had an encounter that seriously rattled me. Not just as a scientist, but as a Navajo with ties to the land. I was out there working a grid near a dry wash about a mile south of the spill site, when suddenly I saw it. A small, mutated yearling deer that stopped me in my tracks. I just stood up after coring a soil sample, my Geiger counter softly ticking away, when I heard a rustle. I looked up, expecting a rabbit or maybe a coyote, but instead, there it was, no taller than my waist, standing around 20 feet away in a rough clearing. It wasn't aggressive. It just stared at me with one cloudy eye. The other was missing, and there was just a sunken socket in its place, while its head was lopsided from a bulging tumor that pushed its skull out of shape. Its legs were all wrong, with the front right so bent that it hobbled even while standing still, and its fur was patchy too, with bald spots showing scabby, discolored skin and a stunted tail that was barely a nub. It didn't move toward me or flee. It just stood there with its breathing very shallow, like it was too weak to do much of anything else. And my first thought was radiation. Chronic exposure causing mutations, especially in younger animals developing in contaminated areas. This deer's deformities, its cranial asymmetry, missing eye, and limb malformation were almost an exact match with the kinds of things folks saw at Chernobyl in the years that followed. The Puerco River was still an irradiated mess, and the deer either drank from it, grazed on contaminated plants, or its mother drank from it while pregnant and passed the poison on. I noted the location in my field book and made a note of that deer's deformities. It made for a very terrifying sight, but as a Navajo, the sight hit deeper. Our ancestors teach us to live in harmony with animals, almost like their family. So seeing this fawn all twisted up and suffering like that, it felt like a violation of that harmony. I checked my Geiger counter and it spiked slightly, about 0.2 millirem per hour higher than the surrounding area. This suggested the young deer might have been exposed to contaminated sediment. I didn't approach it, partly to avoid scaring it and partly because I didn't want to risk contamination. It watched me for maybe a minute and then limped off into the trees. I didn't follow. Instead, I marked the spot for follow-up sampling, knowing that I need to report the encounter to my EPA team as soon as possible. We'd seen sick livestock. A lot of Navajo herders had lost sheep with similar deformities, but that was my first direct encounter with a wild animal so clearly affected by the spill, and I'm not ashamed to say that it left me very, very shaken. I drove back to McGaffey that evening with a heavy heart. My data would go into a report, and I could no doubt use it to push for more cleanup, but the feeling that poor animal gave me was something that I couldn't put into words. Sometime after, in the summer of 1981, I was still heading out on my weekly monitoring trips when a wildfire broke out in the woods south of Church Rock. One of my coworkers, a fellow scientist named Tom, got caught in the fire's path, and what he claimed to have seen while escaping left me wrestling with both my scientific skepticism and my Navajo roots. It had been an unusually hot and dry July, and the woods were a tinderbox after weeks without rain. Tom had gone out early to collect water samples from a wash near our monitoring grid, about 2 miles south of the spill site. I was in McGaffey testing samples when we got word of smoke rising from the trees, and by morning, reports were coming in of a fast-spreading fire that wind was pushing southwest, directly toward our monitoring area. I was in the office, coordinating with our team, when we lost contact with Tom. The fire was moving too quickly for us to send a truck, and the Forest Service was already stretched thin. We just had to sit tight and pray that he'd be okay. Well, our prayers were answered, and by late afternoon, Firefighters found Tom staggering out of the woods near Red Rock. He was barely conscious, black with soot and coughing violently from the severe smoke inhalation, but he was alive. Firefighters rushed him to Gallup Indian Medical Center, where he was treated for burns and respiratory damage. When I visited him the next day, I was relieved to see him alive, but I was incredibly shaken by how close we'd come to losing him. About a week later, when Tom was stable, he gave a statement to the firefighters, and as an EPA official, I got my hands on a copy of their report. It detailed Tom's escape, and as harrowing as it all was, one part stopped me dead cold. Tom said he'd been collecting samples when he noticed the burning smell, and assuming it was some campers that had strayed too far into the exclusion zone, he started walking towards the flame. Then by the time he realized it was a forest fire, the flame was already visible through the trees and the smoke was thickening fast. With the fire closing in, he dropped his gear and just ran, but as he fled, he claimed that he saw something impossible. A huge sphere of flame, about 6 feet around, floating slowly through the woods, maybe 10 to 15 feet off the ground. He said it moved steadily, not flickering like regular flames, but burning up tree trunks as it moved through them. And although he admitted the smoke and the panic made everything a little blurry, he swore it wasn't any kind of hallucination and that he knew what he'd seen. The firefighter's report noted that Tom's account of the sphere was likely a stress-induced misperception of either a large burning branch or debris caught in an updraft. They'd seen no evidence of anything unusual in the burn patterns, just a typical fast-moving wildfire that scorched around 100 acres before containment. But while reading the report in my office, I wasn't so quick to dismiss it. As a Navajo, I'd grown up hearing from elders about strange lights in the woods, small orbs of flame, sometimes called witch lights, that are signs of restless spirits. My grandmother once told me of glowing balls of flames seen at night near sacred sites, and that they were sometimes tied to imbalances in the land. The woods south of Church Rock was now tainted by radioactive waste, and part of me wondered if Tom's sphere was a manifestation of that unrest. But the scientist in me pushed back hard. I'd studied fire behavior in my environmental science courses. Wildfires can create optical illusions like burning gases or superheated air distorting light. On top of that, Tom's smoke inhalation, in combination with carbon monoxide levels high enough to cause confusion, could have easily warped his perception. I checked the fire's burn data and read samples from the area showing no unusual chemical residues, just the standard combustion markers you see in any regular forest fire. Radiation levels in the soil, already elevated from the spill, hadn't spiked any further. In fact, the firefighters said they thought it was a freak lightning strike that started the blaze, and that there was no physical evidence of anything like a floating sphere of flame. But I still couldn't shake that sense of unease. I drove out to the burn site the following week and walked the charred section of the forest where Tom had been. The woods were this weird mix of ash and charred tree trunks, and my Geiger counter clicked at the expected level, nothing out of the ordinary. But standing there, I felt the weight of the land's pain, not just from the spill, but the fire too. I said a quiet prayer for balance, not to mention Tom's recovery, and when I filed my report, his words were a reminder that some things in those woods defy explanation. But as for other things, no matter how frightening they are, they often have very rational and logical explanations. In the fall of 1979, just a few months into my reassignment to the cleanup effort, I witnessed something that haunts me to this day. Something far worse than any mutated animal or wildfire scare. I was out on a routine sampling trip in early September, and my grid that day took me to a rocky outcrop about 1.5 miles south of the spill site, near a small cave tucked into a sandstone ridge. I was testing the trees and soil for radium-226, with my Geiger counter clicking away, when I heard a low groan from inside the cave. It sounded like a wounded animal, maybe a coyote or a deer, hurt and hiding, and I froze and listened. Then the sound came again, so guttural and full of pain that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I thought that it might be a sick animal, so I set down my corer and approached the mouth of the cave, calling out softly as to not startle whatever was inside. Seconds after I started calling out, it crawled out into the sunlight, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't an animal. It was a man, or at least, what was left of one. His skin was peeling off in patches, black, rotten, and oozing with sores that glistened in the light. His jaw was just kind of hanging slack, and his tongue lolled out of his mouth, very swollen, discolored, while his eyes were cloudy circles, sunken in a face that looked more like a corpse than a living person. He dragged himself forward on bony arms, his legs too weak to stand, moaning with each movement. At first I thought he was another mutation, like the animals that I'd feared, but as he emerged, I saw the tattered jeans he was wearing and realized this was a person that had been ravaged by advanced radiation sickness. And my heart was pounding. Nothing I'd ever seen before had ever frightened me so much, but my training kicked in all the same. I knew acute radiation poisoning when I saw it. The skin necrosis, the lesions, the way it looked like he was wasting away. This man had been exposed to extreme levels of radioactivity, likely from lingering in the spill zone where radium and thorium saturated the soil and water. I ran to my truck, grabbed my water canteen, and started begging for mechanics over my radio. I then ran back to the injured man, keeping my distance to avoid contamination, and offered him some water. He tried to drink it, but his throat was so swollen that he couldn't swallow, and he almost choked before coughing and expelling what he'd tried to drink. His groans were weaker by then, his breathing very ragged, but I stayed with him, speaking softly and trying to reassure him he'd be okay until a Forest Service crew arrived with a stretcher. They rushed him to that medical center, but sadly, I learned later that he died in the hospital. My soil samples from near that cave showed radium levels 100 times above those considered safe, enough to kill anyone who lingered there unprotected, and later I got my hands on a copy of that report. He was a hermit, a Navajo man in his 50s who was known to live off and on in the woods near Church Rock. No one knew his full story. Some said that he'd been a miner, others said that he just preferred solitude. But what we knew for certain was he'd either ignored or never heard the EPA's warnings to stay away from the contaminated area. The spill's toxic plume had spread through the washes and into the caves where he likely took shelter. There was also a good chance that he'd been contaminated by drinking from tainted streams or eating tainted plants. Autopsy reports confirmed a lethal radiation exposure. His bone marrow was destroyed, his organs failing, and his skin was literally rotting from the inside out. I was furious, and I wasn't the only one. The spill's radioactive tailings, left largely uncleaned by United Nuclear, had poisoned the land, and this man had paid the ultimate price. I wrote it up in my report, pushing for more aggressive cleanup and better outreach to remote communities. I'd seen sick animals and polluted rivers, but this was different. He was one of us. A Dene, lost to the poison we were fighting. That night in McGaffey, I sat outside, staring at the stars and prayed for forgiveness for not doing enough. But the conclusions to those prayers only hardened my resolve to keep testing and keep fighting so that no one else had to crawl out of a cave, rotting from the inside out while still alive. And by the winter of 1981, my time at Church Rock had ended when the EPA reassigned me to other projects across New Mexico. Resources were tight, and the spill, despite being the largest radioactive disaster in the nation's history, faded from the headlines and the agency's focus shifted. I had to move on to new assignments, but the memories of Church Rock clung to me like the red dust on my boots. The mutated fawn limping through the woods, the strange fireball my coworker swore he saw in the wildfire, and worst of all, that hermit crawling from the cave, his skin rotting from radiation sickness. All those images have been completely tattooed onto my consciousness. The memories push me to keep going, to keep fighting the good fight for my people and our land, even when the odds felt stacked against us. But above all, the spill had exposed how little the government prioritized Navajo lands. Church Rock was a hard lesson in reality. United Nuclear barely cleaned up 1% of the 1,100 tons of spilled waste, and the Puerco River stayed toxic with radium levels still far above safe limits. Families were still too afraid to drink from their wells, herders were losing livestock, and the deep distrust of federal promises grew even deeper. I carried the weight of what I'd seen, the hermit's groans, the fawn's twisted limbs, and used it to drive my work forward. There were no easy fixes, no heroes swooping in to save the day. The land was still contaminated and the threat to my people remained. But those 2 years taught me to stay in the fight and to keep pushing for our homeland's health, even when everything seems stacked against us. So, I've been wanting to get this off my chest for a while now, and I figured your channel might be the place to do it. It's the story of how me and my boyfriend Andy, along with our friends Steve and Kathy, decided to go hiking in Ocala National Forest up in northern Florida. It was supposed to be a fun week, just getting out in nature, away from work and all of that, but it turned into the scariest thing I've ever been through, and I'm honestly shaking right now just thinking about it. It all started out so great. We drove up early Saturday morning excited to hit the trails. The weather was perfect too, sunny, warm, but not too hot. The forest was gorgeous, with these huge trees and all kinds of birds chirping away, and we got up close and personal at one point with a deer just sort of standing there staring at us, and Steve even tried to snap a picture, but it bolted before he could. And so we hiked for a few hours, not on some hardcore trail, just a nice and easy one. We took a bunch of pictures, ate some snacks, and then by the afternoon we were ready to set up camp. And that's when we stumbled onto this spot that looked like a disused campground or maybe even a trailer park. It was kind of run down, like nobody had been there in forever. There was a clearing, some old fire pits half overgrown with weeds, and I'll be honest, it felt perfect. And we're thinking, yeah, this is it. And it made us feel very adventurous, And so we set up our tents, me and Andy in one, Steve and Kathy in the other, and then we gathered some firewood and got ourselves settled in. That first night was so much fun at first. We got a campfire going and the smell of wood burning just made everything feel cozy. We brought some beers, nothing too crazy, just enough to relax. Kathy and I hooked up my little portable speaker to my phone and we played some music. We even danced around the fire a bit, probably looking like total dorks, but we didn't care. It was one of those nights where you feel like nothing can go wrong, like you're in your own little bubble away from the rest of the world. We stayed up pretty late, telling stories and joking around until we finally got tired and crawled into our tents. I fell asleep fast, all happy and warm next to Andy, thinking it was the best weekend ever. And then, everything went to hell. I don't even know what time it was, but I woke up suddenly, and then I smelled it. Smoke. But lots of it, way more than just a campfire. My eyes popped open. I looked out the tent flap and my God, there were flames everywhere, and it looked like the whole forest was on fire. It wasn't just a little campfire gone wrong, it was this huge, roaring wall of orange and red, and I could hear it too, this loud crackling and popping like the whole world was burning up around us. My heart started pounding so hard that I thought it would bust out of my chest, and I screamed and shook Andy awake, yelling, "Fire! Andy, wake up, there's a fire!" He bolts up, sees it, and his face goes pale. We could feel the heat already, seeping into the tent, and the smoke was stinging our eyes, and we had to move, and we had to move fast. We scrambled out, barefoot, half panicked, and ran to Steve and Kathy's tent. I was yelling their names, slapping the fabric, and Andy was shouting, "Get up, we gotta go now." And they stumbled out, looking confused and sleepy, but when they saw the flames, they freaked out too. And we looked around, and it was bad. The fire was on 3 sides of us, closing in fast. The only way out was this patch of woods behind us that wasn't burning yet. I grabbed my phone and wallet from the tent floor. Andy snatched his flashlight and Steve and Kathy grabbed some bare essentials too. We left everything, our bags, our food, the tents, all of it, and we ran for our lives. We ran into the woods, stumbling over roots and branches in the dark. Andy's flashlight was bouncing all over the place, barely lighting the way, and the smoke was thick, making it hard to breathe, and my lungs were burning. I could hear Kathy coughing behind me. Steve was yelling at us to keep going, and we could still see the glow of the fire behind us, this terrible orange light chasing us behind the trees. And I was terrified, full on contemplating that we were going to die terrified. My legs were shaking, but I just kept running because what else could I do? And all I could think was, we have to get out. We have to get out. And it was complete chaos. There were branches scratching at my arms, my bare feet were getting cut up on the rocks, but I didn't care, and we had to get away from that fire at all cost. I kept looking back, and it felt like the flames were right on our heels like some monster out of a horror movie, and my mind was racing. How did this even happen? Did our campfire spread? Was it something else? Was it our fault? But there was no time to figure it out. We were running blind, hoping that we'd hit a road or something, anything safe. And then, just when I thought that it couldn't get worse, out of the darkness, these people appeared. I didn't even see them coming, and then they were blocking our path. They seemed to be wearing masks that looked like they were made of cloth, only with the weird painted faces and rings around the eye holes. And they had weapons too. Some had baseball bats, others had belts, and one guy definitely had a chain because I remember the sound that it made when he swung it. There were maybe 5 or 6 of them, and they moved at us so fast that we couldn't really do anything. Before I could even scream, they began hitting us. One of them grabbed me by the hair and yanked me back so hard that I fell. I hit the ground, and then this sharp pain exploded in my side where he jabbed me in the ribs with his bat. I screamed, curling up, trying to cover myself, but he kicks me again right in the stomach. I could hear Andy yelling, but then he grunted loud, and I looked to see that the thug with the chain had whipped him across the back with it. He fell to his knees, and I thought that I was going to lose it. Steve and Kathy were getting it really bad, and I saw Steve try to shield her, but one of them cracked him in the shoulder with a bat, and he went down. Kathy, sobbing, was trying to pull him up, but they just kept coming. It wasn't just the beating that was bad enough. It was the things that they were saying, too. And oh my God, it was the most disgusting, vile stuff I've ever heard. They were yelling that we were going to die, that they'd do horrible things to us first, stuff I can't even type out because it makes me sick. It was like they enjoyed it, like they wanted us to be scared as possible. Every hit hurt so bad and my arm felt like it might be broken. My legs were all cut up from the falling and getting back up. I was crying, shaking, thinking this was it, that they were going to kill us right there in the woods with the fire roaring behind us. And that's when it hit me. It was probably them that set the fire, just to corral us into their trap. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like hours, but it was probably just minutes. We kept trying to run, dodging between trees, but they'd chase us, laughing and swinging their weapons. Annie grabbed my hand at one point and pulled me up, and we just bolted, not even looking where we were going. Steve and Kathy were right behind us. I knew because I could hear them gasping and crying. And then all of a sudden, those thugs just stopped following us, and they started to yell. I don't know why, maybe they were just done, but I don't think so. I think something else out there scared them. Something even scarier than weapon-wielding maniacs. Maybe a rival gang, a bear, who knows. But we didn't stop to find out. We kept running, tripping over everything until we couldn't hear them anymore and the trees started thinning out. We finally burst out of the woods into this little town nearby, and I don't even remember how we got there, just that we were suddenly on a road, panting, bleeding. We were a mess. Clothes torn, bruises and cuts all over, barefoot and shaking like crazy. We found the sheriff's office and practically fell through the door. The sheriff looked shocked when he saw us, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Gave us some water and we told him everything. The fire, the masked guys, all of it. My voice was shaky, I could barely get the words out, and he wrote it all down and said that he'd send someone out to check it out. We went to the hospital and the cops went out to that location we described. And sure enough, everything was burned. All of our things and a lot of the surrounding trees. There was no sign of that gang, obviously, and it didn't sound like any of the young troublemakers in that area. I honestly still can't believe it happened. We were just trying to have a fun weekend, and it turned into this terrible nightmare that I can't shake. I keep seeing those faces in my head and hearing their voices and feeling the pain all over again, and I haven't slept right since. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in those woods, running from the fire and those psychos. Andy's got nightmares too, and Kathy said Steve's been very quiet, like he's still kind of processing it, and we're all messed up in our own unique ways. And one thing all of us wonder was, what was out there that could have scared those guys even more than they wanted to scare us? So yeah, I just had to tell someone about this, and I guess I want to warn you all too. Be careful when you go out in those woods. I used to love camping, hiking, all that kind of stuff, but now I'm scared to death of it. You never know who's out there with you. Crazy people like those thugs could be anywhere, hiding and waiting. Tell someone where you're going, stick to places that aren't so remote, and maybe don't camp at some creepy abandoned spot like we decided. I don't know if the sheriff ever found those guys or what started the fire, but I don't care anymore. I just want people to stay safe. This was the worst night of my life, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. About 20 years ago now, me and an old mate of mine from school decided to go camping. We've been wanting to camp there for a while because it's one of the largest patches of ancient woodland in the whole of the UK. And since Ozzy and the boys recorded Sabbath Bloody Sabbath at Clearwell Castle, it felt like a bit of a heavy metal pilgrimage. But while both me and my mate were fans of scary music, we most definitely didn't enjoy the little run-in that we had near the little pond we found. We used to camp out the back of my car basically, so after driving up and down forest roads for a while, we found this little side path that ran adjacent to a large pond. There was enough room for us to park the car and still leave room for people to pass us on the path, so we thought that'd be as good a place as any to stop over for the night. Camping there wasn't strictly legal, but we were used to skirting a bit of bureaucracy so we could have a nicer campsite. We didn't make campfires anywhere like that, and we certainly didn't damage any trees or anything. We weren't vandals, so unless a real job's worth came along and threatened to call the police, we were generally free to do as we pleased. Anyway, we parked just off the path, set up our tents, and had some sandwiches for dinner. Then, after watching the sun go down over a few beers and some songs and a portable player, we hit the hay with the intention of staying another night there. But when we woke up the next morning, my mate found a note on his car windshield that just said, "Leave." And I won't lie, we were definitely a bit creeped out knowing someone had been walking around our tents while we'd been asleep. But to be honest, it wasn't the first time something like that had happened. You get kids playing pranks, passive-aggressive note leavers telling you they've informed the National Trust or whatever, and even the occasional dogger who doesn't realize you're even there on the other side of a bush. And on this occasion, we thought it was most probably kids playing a joke on us. The note leavers are generally quite verbose and will leave you a tidy little paragraph explaining why exactly you're so evil for camping on public land. But kids or teenagers trying to scare you will generally leave you a nice little DIE or "we are watching," or in this case, "leave." I asked my mate if he reckoned that we should relocate, even if it was just to the other side of the forest, and I sort of agreed with him when he said no. If the kids or teenagers came back, we'd chase them off and give them a scare of their own, all in good fun, of course, but we certainly weren't going to give them the satisfaction of obeying their single-word order. After that, we were planning on having a walk into the nearby town to get some food and see what pubs they had on offer. But after suggesting that whoever left the note might still be watching us, my mate suddenly wasn't so keen on leaving all of our stuff alone, and we decided to pack away before driving into town to get some food. We found a decent pub, had some food and a swift half, and then as we were sat at the bar, my mate starts talking about going back into the forest and camping in a new spot. It did feel massively emasculating having moved on at the behest of what were probably just some kids playing tricks on us, so to claw back a bit of our pride, we agreed to head back into the Forest of Dean to spend our final night of camping there. So, after lunch, we drove back into the forest and repeated the process of driving up and down the little roads in an attempt to find a camping spot. Eventually we found one, and this time we made sure it was much more secluded than the first. We weren't exactly scared yet, apprehensive of getting our stuff damaged or stolen, but not scared. But then as we set up the tents and got our sixers of beer out of the car boot, my mate saw someone walking towards us down the track. First I heard of it was him going, Jay, in this whispered voice, and the second J was said immediately after the first and sounded urgent in the extreme. I turned around fast and saw a man walking down the track towards us. He had a baseball cap on, with a jumper, jeans, and boots, but covering his face from the eyes down was a scarf, and in his hand, he carried some big wood-chopping axe with a red blade. We didn't try and talk to the guy, and I'm sad to say that I left about 100 quid's worth of camping gear and my beers behind. But we hopped into my car the second I saw him, and then since we had to drive past this guy to actually make it back to the road, I gunned my car right at him so he had to move and couldn't take a swing at us as we passed. We made an anonymous call to the police from the road, not wanting to give away that we'd been breaking the law, but also not wanting some masked psycho to get away with brandishing some axe at us. We assumed it was him that had left that note, too. But who he was and why he'd done it were things we were never able to work out. I suppose there are some proper weirdos out there, and we were always a bit more careful about where we camped after that. On August 2nd of 1982, the Johnson family traveled from their home in the rural Canadian community of Westbank to the Wells Grey Provincial Park in British Columbia. The group consisted of Bob and Jackie Johnson, both in their 40s, along with their two daughters, 13-year-old Janet and 11-year-old Karen. Accompanying them were Jackie's parents, George and Edith Bentley, who joined them for a 2-week camping vacation at a place called Bear Creek, near the site of an old derelict penitentiary. Intent on paddling up and down the nearby creek, the family of experienced campers brought along a small boat, along with a camper van packed with food, water, and medical supplies. The Johnsons were ready for just about anything, and it seemed like 2 weeks of wholesome woodland fun awaited them. Yet unbeknownst to all, they were doomed to befall a tragedy of horrifying proportions. 2 weeks later, on the morning of August 16th, employees at Gorman Brothers Lumber noticed one of their fellow workers had failed to clock in. 44-year-old Bob Johnson wasn't the kind of guy to pull a no-show, but since his boss had been informed of his recent camping trip to Wells Grey, he granted Johnson a few days' grace to account for extenuating circumstances. The next day, he tried giving Bob a call but got no response. He tried again the next day, but once again his call went unanswered. Finally, and following a week of slowly mounting concern, Bob's boss reported him missing to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Search and rescue teams began scouring the area surrounding Bear Creek, the Johnsons' family's last known location. Yet to their confusion, neither the Johnsons nor their vehicles were anywhere to be found. What followed were 4 weeks of fruitless searching and bitter frustration, until finally, on September 13th of 1982, a mushroom picker stumbled across a burned-out car in a woodland clearing not far from a steep logging road. This logging road was over 13 miles away from the location of the Johnsons' camp. Yet the wreckage bore an eerie resemblance to the car that the family had traveled to the park in. After being alerted by the mushroom picker, RCMP officers were immediately dispatched to the scene, and when they arrived, they made a chilling discovery. Following an examination of the burned vehicle's interior, officers found a pile of charred bones in the back seat. The remains were carefully bagged and transported for analysis, and while many had hoped they might be nothing but animal bones, their worst fears were soon confirmed. The charred skeletons, which had been unceremoniously shoved into the car, doused in accelerant and set alight, belonged to the missing Johnson family. In their subsequent investigation, police began interviewing local residents, one of whom claimed to have spotted the Johnsons camping much further away from Bear Creek than had originally been expected. After pinpointing the location of his second campsite, a search was organized, and it didn't take long to find some beer caps of the brand known to be drunk by Bob Johnson, along with 6 spent .22 caliber bullet casings. However, the Johnsons' 1981 Ford camper, not to mention the remainder of their possessions, were still nowhere to be found. For months, the investigation into the Johnson family's deaths failed to progress. In April of the following year, a television reenactment of the killings were filmed at the site of the murders, which was then broadcast across Canada. Police hoped the reenactment would yield fruitful leads, but despite being flooded with calls and tips, there were no breaks in the case. Police also went so far as to create a replica of the family's Ford camper down to the very finest detail, including the aluminum boat which had been strapped to its roof. Then in the late spring of 1983, they drove the trailer all the way from British Columbia to Quebec, hoping a sighting of it might prompt the right person to come forward. It was a bold move, but once again, it yielded no tangible results, and despite receiving 1,300 alleged sightings, all were proven to be either, at best, mistaken sightings, or at worst, malicious disinformation. Eventually, on October 18th of 1983, and a total of 14 months following the Johnson family's murders, their camper van was finally discovered by 2 forestry workers near Trophy Mountain. The location was just over 15 miles from the site of the murders and around 20 from where the Johnsons' car was found. Forensic investigators determined that, much like their car, some kind of accelerant had been used in the torching of the camper van, most likely gasoline mixed with some other variety of flammable liquid. It was also clear that someone had tried very hard to ensure the van was well hidden, and there was evidence someone had attempted to drive it into a nearby gorge, but a patch of fallen logs had blocked their path. The RCMP had the van's burned-out remains airlifted to its Vancouver crime lab, but although its remnants provided no clues, the location of its discovery proved of great interest to investigators. The abandoned logging road on Trophy Mountain, where the vehicle was found, was not easy to access, with one local resident saying that only someone who knew the area would have been aware of such an isolated spot. In other words, Johnson's killer lived chillingly close by. The theory prompted officers to return to their door-to-door canvassing with renewed vigor, and it was during this new period of questioning that they finally made a break in the case. After speaking with an unnamed member of a small rural community surrounding Wells Gray, police learned that around the same time as the murders, a man named David Shearing had asked them how to repair a hole in the door of a car, as well as how to re-register one. The 24-year-old lived 3 miles from the site of the murders, and on November 19th of 1983, RCMP officers found Shearing north of Kamloops, where he was due to appear in court on a stolen property charge. He was taken into custody and questioned extensively. What emerged was a classic story of the familial black sheep. Despite an extensive criminal record and a reputation for wild behavior, Shearing's father made his living as a prison guard, and his brother was a sheriff in the provincial police force. He had been a solid student, graduated high school, and completed a heavy mechanics course. And somewhere along the way, something went wrong for young David. RCMP detectives Mike Eastham and Ken Liebel were convinced of Shearing's guilt and gained his confidence by initially claiming his arrest was completely unrelated to the Johnson family murders. In fact, they got Shearing so relaxed that he agreed to be questioned without a lawyer, and in doing so, had walked right into the detective's trap. As it happened, David Shearing was actually one of the first individuals to have been interviewed by the RCMP following the discovery of the Johnson family's remains. The interview took place in Shearing's backyard, situated around a mile from the scene of the murders, and through one of his home's windows, an officer spotted a .22 caliber rifle hanging on the wall, the exact same kind used in the murders. When asked why they didn't seize the firearm and test it to see if the casings fired from it matched those found at the scene, Inspector Vic Edwards cited basic rights preventing unlawful searches and seizures. "I don't have any right to go into your house and examine your guns," he said, "the same as I didn't have any right to go into Mr. Shearing's house. We had no reason to suspect him." Initially, Shearing was led to believe that his arrest was related to a hit-and-run incident before the detective suddenly confronted him with their theories surrounding the Johnson murders. Then, in his explanation, Shearing accidentally admitted to detectives that he had heard the murders were committed at Bear Creek, information that had not been released to the public yet. Then, after a lot of effort and persuasive techniques, the two detectives managed to convince Shearing to confess, to all 6 Johnson family murders. He also agreed to reenact the murders to show detectives exactly how things went down, and even promised to turn over their possessions so they could be properly returned to their loved ones. But perhaps most important to the case, Shearing agreed to give up the .22 caliber Remington pump-action rifle, which was forensically confirmed to be the murder weapon. Shearing initially confessed to shooting the 4 adults as they sat around their campfire. He then claimed to have shot the Johnsons' 2 daughters as they slept in their tent, and that his only motivation for doing so was to rob them without risking any witnesses. He told the detectives interviewing him that after loading the Johnsons' bodies into their car, he drove it to the mountainside under cover of darkness and then set it on fire using 5 gallons of gasoline. He then claimed to have shot the Johnsons' 2 daughters as they slept in their tent, and that his only motivation for doing so was to rob them without risking any witnesses. He told the detectives interviewing him that after loading the Johnsons' body into their car, he drove it to the mountainside under cover of darkness and then set it on fire using 5 gallons of gasoline. He then attempted, but ultimately failed, to clean the campsite as best as possible, then drove the camper back to his home before burning it after learning how difficult the re-registration process was. On the day Shearing's trial was set to begin, he pled guilty to 6 counts of second-degree murder. As part of the guilty plea, Shearing stated the following: "I walked out of the bush from behind the camper and started shooting. I put the bodies in the car, 4 in the back seat and the 2 little ones in the trunk. I poured the gasoline. It just went woomph, and I stood back and watched it burn. I went to the tent, I knelt down, and I shot the other 2. The court had no choice but to accept Shearing's version of events, but to the detectives, his story didn't ring true. They knew he wasn't telling the whole truth, but their hunch wouldn't be confirmed until a later date. In his sentencing, Supreme Court Justice Harry Mackay said, "What we have, very simply, is a cold-blooded and senseless execution of 6 defenseless and innocent victims for no apparent reason. The sentence I impose must express in clear terms the revulsion felt by the great majority of our citizens for this senseless and vicious mass killing. The victims were unknown to the prisoner. They did not in any way provoke him. He knew they were camped at the site and carefully scouted the situation. He went home and returned either that night or the next with a loaded .22 rifle. Why? We do not really know, but the enormity of the crimes demand the maximum sentence." On April 17, 1984, Justice Mackay sentenced Shearing to 6 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole for at least 25 years. It was the maximum possible penalty for second-degree murder, and the first time in Canadian history it had been handed out. Shearing did not appeal his sentence. His mother, Rose Shearing, was stunned at the news of her son's conviction. "I hope it's a mistake or a bad dream," she said. "He's always been such a good boy." Greg Shearing, David's brother, said, "I have a lot of questions I'd like to ask the police. I have a hard time believing all of this." Following Shearing's conviction, Detective Mike Eastham, who'd long harbored suspicions of Shearing's dishonesty, pleaded for a chance to re-interview him in a search of the whole truth. When he obtained it, it was just as disturbing as he'd imagined. At one point during the interview, Detective Eastham told Shearing, "You know why I'm here? I think you abused those girls before you killed them. You told me some time ago that you would consider telling me the rest of the story after you were sentenced. Well, now I'm here to collect." It was only then that David Shearing revealed what really happened to the Johnsons' 2 daughters. Shearing confessed that after first spotting the Johnsons' family camped out near Bear Creek, he spent several days spying on them. He admitted to harboring deeply inappropriate thoughts towards 13-year-old Jeanette and 11-year-old Karen, and became determined to abuse them, even if it meant murdering their parents. Finally, on the evening of August 10th, Shearing walked into the campsite with his rifle and then shot all 4 adults in cold blood. Janet and Karen had been sleeping in their tent, and the sound of the shots woke them up. Shearing reassured them that he and their parents were protecting them from bad men, then went about disposing of the adults' bodies. Once he was finished, he crawled into the tent with the girls and subjected them to acts of unforgivable depravity. The next morning, after ensuring their parents' bodies were covered with a blanket, Shearing transported Janet and Karen to a nearby fishing shack. It was here he intended on continuing the abuse, but in a stunning twist of fate, the shack was approached by none other than a prison correctional officer who was out supervising a fishing trip for well-behaved prisoners. The CO visited the cabin to reassure Shearing regarding their presence in the area, but before he came to the door, Shearing hid the girls in another room, told them to stay quiet, then conducted a brief conversation with the correctional officer without once arousing the man's suspicion. The next day, he moved the girls to his family farm. Then on August 16th, he walked them into a patch of woodland near one of his fields and shot them both in the head. He reportedly told the girls to turn around so he could urinate, and then he shot them execution style. Shearing then took the bodies back to the Johnsons' family car, put the girls' bodies in the trunk, and burned it. To confirm Shearing was now telling the truth, Detective Eastham tracked down the prison guard the killer was referring to. The CO remembered the meeting exactly as Shearing had described it, and when Eastham's partner, a Constable Liebel, hiked through the woods to pay a personal visit to the cabin, he found 2 sets of initials carved into the wood. DS for David Shearing, and then JJ for Janet Johnson. The initials had been encapsulated in a crudely carved heart shape, a detail which made Liebel's skin crawl. The same detective later reflected on how close the prison guard had been to saving Janet and Karen's lives. That's how close everyone was, he said. But for a cruel act of fate, those 2 precious little girls would be alive today. In 1995, Shearing married a woman from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. Heather Ennis, who met her bloodthirsty beau in 1993, claimed her husband deserved a second chance. "I have seen so much change in this man since we met," she said. "I know the man's heart is in the right place, and I'm just here to back him up." In September 2008, exactly 24 years following his conviction for the Johnson family murders, David Shearing finally came up for parole. Yet thankfully, the Canadian National Parole Board ruled that since he hadn't completed sex offender treatment and was rumored to still harbor violent fantasies, he was not yet ready for freedom. His second application, filed in 2012, was also rejected when the petition of almost 14,000 signatures was presented to the National Parole Board. Shearing applied again in 2014, but mysteriously withdrew the request a month before his hearing. Perhaps he's tired of trying to fool the parole board into thinking he's a safe, sane, and stable human being. Or maybe he's accepted he's a danger to wider society and has submitted to being sequestered from it for the remainder of his natural years. We might never know Shearing's reasons for withdrawing his appeal, and while some of us might wish to understand his thinking, I would caution against crawling around the mind of a man who murdered 2 innocent couples in order to prey on their 2 little girls. On a chilly November morning back in 1985, a hunter was quietly plodding through the forests of Bear Brook State Park near Allenstown, New Hampshire. Located around 15 miles from the state capital of Concord, the park spans over 10,000 acres of wetlands and rolling forests, making it one of the state's largest areas of natural beauty. Bear Brook also offers a network of trails for hiking, biking, and horseback riding. Tracks which weave through dense woods that teem with wildlife. Yet the park's tranquil beauty belies a darker history, marked by a series of grim discoveries which cast a somber shadow over the serene landscape. This is the story of the bodies in the barrels. As the hunter walked near the charred ruins of an old burned-down general store, his eyes caught a glint of metal from some nearby underbrush. Curiosity got the better of him. Then, on closer inspection, he found the glint belonged to the rusted metal of a 55-gallon oil drum. Unable to temper his burning curiosity, the man heaved the drum upright and then pried its lid from its moorings. But when he did so, he was faced with a picture of pure horror. Stuffed into the drum were the plastic-wrapped bodies of 2 young women. The oldest was likely in her 20s or early 30s, while the much younger girl was perhaps 8 to 10 years old. Autopsies later revealed that the cause of death for both individuals had been brutal blunt force trauma. Yet while it was easy to determine how they died, discerning who they were was a far more difficult task. The older of the 2 victims was a young Caucasian, perhaps in her late 20s or early 30s, but with traces of Native American ancestry. Her teeth, marked by multiple fillings and 3 extractions, hinted at a life of personal and perhaps familial neglect. She also had curly brown hair and was somewhere between 5 feet 2 and 5 feet 7 inches tall. Found beside her was a girl no older than 11, but possibly as young as 5, and she bore signs of a hard life. In life, she stood between 4'3" and 4'6" tall, and pneumonia had severely scarred her lungs. She had a crooked front tooth. There were noticeable gaps between her top teeth, but unlike the older females, her teeth bore no fillings. Police appealed to the public for information, but when no one came forward to claim the nameless victims, they were laid to rest in an Allenstown cemetery under a simple tombstone bearing the following inscription: "Here lies the mortal remains, known only to God, of a woman aged 23 to 33 and a girl child aged 8 to 10. Their slain bodies were found on November 10, 1985, in Bear Brook State Park. May their souls find peace in God's loving care." For a long, long time, it seemed the females' identities would forever remain a mystery. Yet 15 years later, on May 9th of the year 2000, the woods whispered another secret. Near the exact same spot the first barrel was found, investigators uncovered a second 55-gallon drum lying just below the original crime scene's boundaries. Somehow, it had been missing during the initial search, and inside were the remains of 2 children. They too had been dispatched via blunt force trauma. The older child had been between the ages of 2 and 4 years old when she was murdered, and had stood at a mere 3 feet 8 inches tall. The police also determined her pronounced overbite, along with a gap between her front teeth, may have given her a distinctive and easily recognizable smile. Investigators later determined she may have battled anemia during her brief existence, while DNA samples revealed she was the daughter of a man named Terry Peder Rasmussen. The youngest was between the ages of 1 and 3 years old, a toddler whose life was cut short before it could truly begin. She stood between 2 feet 1 and 2 feet 6 inches tall, had long blonde or light brown hair, and like the others, she had a gap between her 2 front teeth. In the early days in the investigation, detectives cast a wide net, sharing details of the case across the United States and into parts of Canada, and what amounted to a desperate search for answers. They chased down hundreds of leads, ruling out at least 10 possible identities for the victims in the process. But even after weeks upon weeks of solid investigation, the names of the woman and 3 girls remained elusive. In June of 2013, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children breathed new life into the case by unveiling a series of updated facial reconstructions. These weren't just sketches. They were digitally rendered images which included important physiological details, such as the gaps and overbites that shaped the victims' faces. They were, however, rendered in a haunting black and white, as their skin tones and eye colors were details that had not yet been determined. As science advanced, so did the clues, because in 2015, DNA profiling unlocked a key piece of the puzzle. Analysis of their mitochondrial DNA showed the oldest victim was the mother of the 2 youngest, and they were believed to have lived together in the northeastern United States for at least 2 weeks to 3 months prior to their deaths. They must have moved to the Bear Brook area not too long before their deaths, possibly in an attempt to escape their killer. DNA analysis also confirmed that the 3rd child was indeed the daughter of Terry Peder Rasmussen, a serial killer who'd passed away in prison back in 2010. He was convicted of just 1 murder, but was linked to at least 5 more in a series of crimes that stretched across the country between 1978 and 2002. Due to his use of many aliases, most notably Bob Evans, Rasmussen became known by the chilling moniker, the Chameleon Killer. In 1999, a young man posted a message on the website Ancestry.com hoping to find Sarah, an older half-sister he'd never met, who was born in California during her father's time in the Marines. Nearly 2 decades later, in October 2018, a librarian turned amateur detective named Rebecca Heath stumbled across the man's post while scouring the internet for clues to the identities of the Bear Brook victims. After digging deeper, Heath learned that Sarah's mother, Marlise Honeychurch, had an older daughter from a previous marriage, and their ages chillingly aligned with the 3 related victims found in Allenstown barrels. Another breakthrough came when a relative Heath contacted revealed that Marlise had married a man named Rasmussen. Convinced that she had cracked the case, Heath shared her discovery with Detective Peter Headley, setting the stage for a long overdue reckoning. On June 6, 2019, New Hampshire police had a press conference in which they revealed the identities of 3 of the Bear Brook victims. The eldest was Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch, born in 1954, and her daughters were Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, born in 1971, and Sarah Lynn McWaters, born in 1977. The family had vanished from their home in La Puente, California around Thanksgiving of 1978, and it was deemed no coincidence that Marlise had been dating Terry Peder Rasmussen at the time. Following a heated argument with her mother, Marlise stormed out, taking her daughters with her and cutting all ties with her family. She then began using the alias Elizabeth Evans for legal documents in May of 1980, no doubt as an attempt to avoid being found. According to friends, Marlise's life prior to meeting Rasmussen had been a tapestry of failed relationships. She married Marie's father in June of 1971, but divorced him just a few years later in 1974. She then wed young Sarah's father in September of that same year, but they too separated shortly after their engagement. By the time she began dating Rasmussen, Marlise had regained custody of both her daughters, but unfortunately, this put them right in the clutches of one of America's most elusive serial killers. In 2002, Terry Peder Rasmussen was found guilty of murdering his then-wife, Eun Sun Jun. His pattern involved forming relationships with women and their children, often living with them for months or years before killing them. The Bear Brook victims were killed by blunt force trauma, then dismembered and disposed of in barrels, exactly the way Rasmussen disposed of Eun Sun Jun. But what sets the Bear Brook murders apart from his other works of malice is that in this case, Rasmussen chose to murder his own daughter, his own flesh and blood. Over the years, many have asked why, but unfortunately, it seems his motivation will forever remain a mystery. In November 2019, a funeral was held in Allenstown to honor Marlise and Marie. Their names were etched on a new headstone to replace the one that had mourned them as unknowns. While family members, including some of Marlise's relatives and Rasmussen's daughter from his first marriage, gathered to say goodbye. Little Sarah, on the other hand, was laid to rest in Connecticut, closer to her father's family at the behest of her elderly paternal grandparents. Marlise Honeychurch, Marie Vaughn, and Sarah McWaters each had their lives cut short before being buried in rusted oil drums, but they were lucky enough to have their names restored. The same cannot be said for the 4th child's identity. Known only as Rasmussen's daughter through advanced DNA testing, the identity of the young girl found in the 2nd drum remains a mystery. Her mother is believed to be one of Rasmussen's victims, but much like her daughter, her exact identity remains unknown. In 2021, forensic investigators traced the 4th girl's lineage to relatives in Pearl River County, Mississippi, while around the same time, Rasmussen's daughter from his first marriage shared a haunting memory. Andrea Steers believes she met this girl, whom she calls Jane Doe, when they were both very young and recalls her quite possibly being half Asian. Yet even with so many pieces of the puzzle having already fallen into place, the full story of this child still lingers in the shadows, waiting to be told. The Bear Brook murders, having been shrouded in mystery for decades, paint a haunting picture of loss and resilience, where the persistent pursuit of truth reclaimed lost identities from the clutches of a serial killer. In one case, the investigation was taken up by an unpaid member of the general public, a librarian who dedicated her spare time to delivering answers to those who needed them most. Rasmussen might have forced his own personal darkness on the world. But it seems for every one monster who sows pain and death, there are hundreds of good-natured citizens lighting candles to guide the way. May they be commended, and may they continue their fight against evil until, God willing, there is no more evil to fight. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations. Look at it anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, microwave your twinks.